My name is Derrick Broze. For the last 10 years, I've worked as an investigative journalist, hosting a radio show, writing books, and producing numerous documentaries about the realities of child trafficking, the dangers of technology, and indigenous struggles. Now, I aim to uncover whether there exists a network of individuals and institutions which ties these issues together. Many researchers posit the existence of an international cartel which covertly manipulates world events for their own benefit. Are these claims simply fantasy and paranoid delusion, or is there truly an agenda to subvert humanity to the demands of the pyramid of power?
Chapter 9: The Prison Industrial Complex. We have now peered into the reality of corruption, lies, and disinformation, which is designed to keep the people of the world blissfully unaware of the true source of their pain. We have identified another layer of the pyramid of power: the big wireless firms, the big oil titans, also known as the oligarchy, the big pharmaceutical corporations, and the medical cartel. And finally, the ways in which the food system and food itself is used as a weapon against the people. Now, our journey continues as we progress further into the labyrinth of a hidden history and deep politics. What other pieces of the pyramid of power are waiting to be revealed? While we have thus far focused on various institutions and organizations which seek to impede or disempower the people, we also need to take a moment to look at the ways in which people are captured by industries which seek to profit off our bodies and minds. More specifically, we need to understand the ways in which the prison system, the laws passed by governments and enforced by police, and a number of intersecting factors can prevent the people from being free and reaching their full potential. We need to understand the prison industrial complex. The prison industrial complex is often described as overlapping interests of government and industry who use surveillance, policing, and imprisonment as solutions to economic and political problems. It is a web of relationships involving public and private prisons, the companies who offer probation and parole services, the police, the courts, and the transportation, feeding, and selling daily necessities to prisoners. Critics argue that this confluence of organizations see a spike in crime as a business opportunity rather than a social problem to be solved for the betterment of society. These critics believe that the prison industrial complex leads to more crime because the source of their profits is prisoners, and thus they have a perverse incentive to maintain criminal activity. The nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank Interrogating Justice calls the PIC, quote, a symbiotic relationship between police departments, court systems, probation offices, transportation companies, food service providers, and many others, all of which ultimately benefit from maintaining incarceration. In recent years, critics of the prison systems have begun including privatized immigration detention centers in their analysis. These holding facilities, which are often unsafe and lacking adequate supplies to house families and children, are used to imprison undocumented immigrants for indeterminate amounts of time. According to a 2018 report from the New York Times, 73% of immigrants detained in the U.S. are housed in private facilities. Opponents of private prisons say the detention centers operate with little regulation or oversight and have a clear financial incentive to cut medical, food, and maintenance costs. Companies benefiting off the prison industrial complex include Aramark, 3M, Amazon, Bank of America, JP Morgan Chase, Microsoft, Western Union, and Wells Fargo. Private prison operators include CoreCivic, Ferrovial, Geo Group, and Serco Group. Other criticisms of the PIC involve the criminalizing of poverty. Namely, critics say that the so-called criminal justice system targets low-income individuals, often in communities of color. The Prison Policy Initiative says that, quote, poverty is not only a predictor of involvement with the justice system, but also an outcome of getting wrapped up in the prison industrial complex. For example, if an individual is living in poverty and chooses to commit a low-level offense, let's say a nonviolent but invasive theft, they will not only find themselves locked in a cage with a criminal record, but they will also be saddled with countless fines, fees, and other costs associated with the process. Even after someone does their time in jail or prison, when they are released, they will contend with the probation or parole system. This system demands monthly fees, classes, and therapy sessions which are ostensibly aimed at rehabilitating people, but which are ultimately drains on their income. Sometimes, individuals will find their driver's license suspended upon arrest, forcing them to walk, use public transportation, or drive without a license. This reinforces more costs on the taxpayer, and some argue also endangers the public because of an increase in unlicensed drivers. Additionally, there are criticisms of the money bail system in the United States, a system in which a defendant is required to pay a certain amount of money as a guarantee they will attend future court hearings. If the defendant is unable to come up with the money for bail, they can be incarcerated from their arrest until their case is resolved or dismissed in court. The Prison Policy Initiative says this goes against constitutional protections of assumptions of innocent until proven guilty, and that the rise of jail population inside the United States is driven by detention of legally innocent people. Because of this, the initiative says a reform of the criminal justice system and the prison industrial complex must include a discussion of local jails and the need for pretrial detention reform. While this is not the norm in all of the world, it is in many Western nations, which has almost 25% of the world's prisoners and the highest incarceration rate in the world. These astronomical levels of incarceration also include juveniles under the age of 18. This criminalization of youth can be seen as a symptom of the prison industrial complex. The trend of taking children out of public schools and into the juvenile and criminal justice system is often known as the school-to-prison pipeline. Children who fall prey to this pipeline typically follow a pattern. First, there are often a lack of resources at a school, not enough teachers per student, and limited funding for counselors and mental health guidance. Second, schools are increasingly enacting zero-tolerance policies where students can be expelled or suspended for something as simple as bringing nail clippers to school. Couple these factors with the increasing militarization of schools, with cops heavily armed, metal detectors, cameras, and random searches of personal property, and you have a recipe for disaster. If a child acts out or breaks a rule in this environment, he might find himself sent to an alternative disciplinary school, and soon enough, the police and the courts get involved. The increase in cops in schools can lead to students being criminalized for behavior that previously would have been handled inside the school. This often leads to a child being introduced to the juvenile justice system. Finally, the prison industrial complex is a system which is not focused on actually correcting bad or antisocial behavior through reform. Instead, critics argue that this system produces more violence, imprisons low-level, non-violent offenders, costs billions of dollars of taxpayer money, and dehumanizes the prisoners. The history of the prison industrial complex. By the early 19th century, governments began to get involved in the business of running prisons. Private businesses began to provide contracting services for food, medical care, and transportation. However, there were times when government-run prisons collaborated with private businesses in exchange for labor. This can be seen prominently in the convict lease system in the American South. This system involved private parties paying public prisons for forced labor. Prisons were often rented out to plantation owners and corporations for mining coal, laying bricks, or cutting timber. The Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company was one of the largest users of prison laborers, mostly comprised of African Americans convicted of petty crimes. U.S. Steel was another American company who has since acknowledged using African American convict labor. These corporations would be responsible for feeding, clothing, and housing the prisoners. This would often result in unsanitary or dangerous conditions. This system would ultimately lose favor, with Alabama being the last state to outlaw the practice in 1928. The system drew criticism for a number of highly publicized abuses, including the case of Martin Tabbert, a young white man from North Dakota who had been arrested in Florida for being on a train without a ticket. Tabbert was fined $25. His parents sent the money, but it disappeared somewhere along the way, and Martin was subsequently leased to the Putnam Lumber Company in Clara, Florida, south of Tallahassee. Martin would end up being whipped with a leather strap by the boss until he died. The story made national headlines and resulted in Florida Governor Carrie A. Hardy ending convict leasing in 1923. As the governments of the world began to participate in the prison industry, new institutions began to pop up, including the establishment of the Federal Prison Industries in the United States in 1930. Federal Prison Industries, also known as UNICOR, is a prison labor program whereby inmates produce goods and services for the public sector. Under U.S. federal law, all physically able inmates who are not a security risk or have a health exemption are required to work, either for UNICOR or another prison job. In the United States, inmates earn between 23 cents to $1.15 per hour. Some critics equate this labor program to a form of modern-day slavery. While the convict labor program may have ended the practice of loaning out prisoners to corporations, there are also concerns around the growth of the private prison industry. Today, the private prison industry operates facilities for immigrant detainees. These prisons are run by private corporations who enter into a contract with the government. This contract outlines how a corporation is getting paid, which can be determined by the size of the prison, or in most cases, it is paid based on the number of inmates that the prison houses. Critics point to the incentive to create financial profits and cut costs as a reason why private prisons should be abolished or greatly reduced. Some of the companies who profit off cheap prison labor include McDonald's, Wendy's, Walmart, Starbucks, Sprint, Verizon, Victoria's Secret, Fidelity Investments, JCPenney, and American Airlines. The prison industrial complex of today includes the public and private prisons, the parole and probation services, the cash bail system, the unjust laws and sentencing, the school-to-prison pipeline, and many other factors. So what led to the creation of this corporate-state relationship which imprisons and destroys lives? The causes of the prison industrial complex. A 2014 report by the National Research Council identified two main causes of the increase in the United States incarceration rate over the previous 40 years: longer prison sentences and increases in the likelihood of imprisonment. The NRC claims the longer prison sentences were the main driver of increasing incarceration rates since 1990. These longer sentences are part of so-called three-strike rules, where a prisoner is given lengthy mandatory minimum sentences after 3 arrests. In the United States, these practices can be traced to the government's war on drugs, a campaign launched in the early 1970s aimed at criminalizing and punishing drug trafficking and use.
We must wage what I have called total war against public enemy number one in the United States, the problem of dangerous drugs.
American presidents Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan introduced anti-drug legislation with harsher punishments. During this time, incarceration of nonviolent drug users became the norm. Many critics of the prison industrial complex point to the drug war as the main cause of the growth of the prison system. From the 1970s on, Americans were subjected to jail and prison for nonviolent drug offenses, such as using drugs or simply being in possession. This resulted in imprisoning and ruining of millions of people's lives. The tough on crime and drugs mentality was embraced by then New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller of the infamous Rockefeller family. In January 1973, Rockefeller rolled out a political campaign focused on ending the use of drugs and pushing for mandatory prison sentences of 15 years to life for those caught with small amounts of cannabis, cocaine, and heroin.
I have one goal, one objective, and that is to stop the pushing of drugs and to protect the innocent victim.
It is this legacy which spread around the United States and parts of the world and has created a worldwide prison industry. As of January 2022, the U.S. Federal Bureau of Prisons says 45% of federal inmates are incarcerated because of drug convictions. However, in many places around the world, we have seen a shift in the last 2 decades as relatively harmless substances like cannabis become legalized or decriminalized. This is also due in part to a resurgence of research on psychedelic substances like mushrooms, LSD, and MDMA. More and more people are seeing the drug war as a cause of more harm rather than a solution. Ultimately, the wider acceptance of certain substances has not necessarily led to retroactive policy shifts. The fact is, there are still people sitting behind bars for drug charges in states or nations which have reduced penalties for drug use or possession. This is why a growing number of criminal justice activists are calling for freeing prisoners who are held for drug charges based on drugs which are now legal or decriminalized, including cannabis. After all, why should someone languish away in prison for weed or mushrooms or any substance that people outside the prison walls can use freely or even purchase legally at dispensaries? In places like Portugal, where the possession of all drugs was decriminalized in 2001, policies have shifted towards a health-focused approach. An individual who is caught in possession of drugs for personal use is treated as an administrative issue rather than a criminal one. In the last 20 years, Portugal has maintained lower rates of drug use and has seen the portion of prisoners sentenced for drugs drop from 40 to 15%. Despite fear-mongering that such a move would lead to more crime and more drug addiction, the opposite has been true. Many critics also believe the roots of the drug war itself stem from racism and a desire to criminalize Black and brown communities. There are arguments about the structural challenges facing Black and brown people resulting from a legacy of colonization, domination, and slavery, but there are also those who point directly to the words of officials within the Nixon administration. It was this administration that played a huge role in advancing the hard-on-drugs, tough-on-crime language. For example, in a 2016 article for Harper's Magazine, journalist Dan Baum recounted a story told by John Ehrlichman, Richard Nixon's domestic policy advisor during his presidency. Quote, "You want to know what this is really all about?" Ehrlichman asked in regards to the drug war. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and Black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or Black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. According to the Prison Policy Initiative, because people of color often face disproportionately high rates of poverty, they also suffer from the justice system's unequal treatment of poor people. Black Americans in particular are disproportionately likely to be incarcerated and to receive the harshest sentences, including death sentences. However, despite the criticism of the drug war, mandatory minimum sentences, and subsequent mistreatment of people of color and poor people, recent research claims that these are not the root causes for the growth of the prison industrial complex. A Pew Research study released in 2020 found that the imprisonment rates of Black Americans have fallen by a third since 2006. In fact, Fordham University criminal justice expert John Pfaff claims the drug war and mandatory minimum sentences are not to blame for the growth in prison population. In his book, Locked In, The True Causes of Mass Incarceration and How to Achieve Real Reform, Pfaff uses facts and statistics to show that the focus on the drug war misses a lot about the reality of the criminal justice system. Pfaff places the blame for a lack of context around mass incarceration on the 2010 book The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration and the Age of Colorblindness by Michelle Alexander, which he says leaves out important factors. He says it's not drug offenses that are driving mass incarceration, but violent crime. Quote, "In reality, only about 16% of state prisoners are serving time on drug charges, and very few of them, perhaps only around 5 or 6% of that group, are both low-level and non-violent." He also says the federal government is not the leader in mass incarceration, but rather prison systems on the state and local level which are leading the charge. While Pfaff acknowledges that police and lawmakers are part of the problem, he says the conversation also fails to mention the role played by prosecutors who are often out of the public and political spotlight. This blind spot for prosecutors obscures the fact that local and state prosecutors are incredibly powerful in the U.S. criminal justice system because they have the ability to prosecute however they see fit. This can be seen in cases where district attorneys have decided to refuse certain nonviolent cases. For example, if a DA decides they no longer want to enforce cannabis laws in an area where cannabis is still considered illegal, the police have no choice but to cooperate and ignore those offenses. Also, more than 90% of criminal cases are resolved through a plea agreement, putting the prosecutors and defendants largely in charge of which cases result in imprisonment and which do not. The reports by the U.S. Bureau of Justice Statistics show that in state prisons, the majority of prisoners are in for violent offenses such as murder, manslaughter, robbery, assault, and rape, while less than a quarter are in for nonviolent drug offenses. Pfaff argues that this context illustrates why mass incarceration happened. He believes it was an overreaction to the massive waves of violent crime in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. This overreaction, he says, is what led to mass incarceration and the growth of what we now know as the prison industrial complex. Life after prison. One of the final detrimental aspects of the prison industrial complex is what happens once you leave. As noted before, probation and parole are often traps meant to keep money going into the prison industrial complex and threaten those who can't pay fines or jump through other judicial hoops with re-imprisonment. Once you leave prison or jail, you are also marked with a bullseye and labeled felon, a scarlet letter that makes it difficult to find jobs, housing, and generally stigmatizes an individual to the ignorant public who assume everyone who has been to prison or has a criminal record must be a dangerous, violent person. Felons also have difficulty getting student loans, public housing, welfare support, and have higher rates of recidivism, homelessness, and suicide. For many former convicts, it feels like once you have been marked, the world gives up on you.
I can speak from personal experience in this area of research. When I was 20 years old, I became addicted to drugs and was arrested. I was convicted of felony drug possession and sentenced to probation and prison time. In the end, I would serve 18 months behind bars before being released as a felon. I had firsthand experience of being denied housing, being denied jobs, and generally being judged for having a felony on my record. In my experience, I saw how the courts expect you to pay fines, take random drug tests, and attend meetings, or else risk being sent back to prison. For many people, being on probation or parole is like having one foot inside the system and one foot outside, because if your probation officer believes you violated the conditions, they can send you back to prison without a moment's notice.
These circumstances lead to an increase of stress and potential for falling back into unhealthy habits because of the pressure to meet every stipulation, lest you be sent back to a cage. I witnessed many brilliant minds find themselves wrapped up in the prison industrial complex and struggle to find a way out. Many of the people I met while in prison are still cycling in and out of the prison industrial complex, while others lost their lives to drug addictions. The few wise ones who caught on quick never came back to the horrible institution. What will it take to change this destructive, wasteful, and ineffective model of justice so we can properly rehabilitate those who are in need of help? Solutions. There are several potential solutions with which to tackle the prison industrial complex. The first involves attempts at using politics or legislation to overhaul and reform the prison systems. In 2018, former President Donald Trump passed the First Step Act, which was heralded as the first serious attempt at reform of the criminal justice system in decades. The First Step Act introduced several measures, including a good time credit fix, which saw 3,100 people released in July 2019. Some were released a few days early, others were released months before their original sentences. The First Step Act also expanded retroactive changes to drug law, allowing people who had been convicted of possession of a small amount of crack cocaine to be released early. The U.S. Department of Justice said the act had reduced sentences for more than 3,000 people. Altogether, it is estimated the First Step Act reduced the federal prison population by about 5,000 people. In the first year of his administration, President Joe Biden signed an executive order which ended the Department of Justice's use of private prisons. The order claims the goal is focusing on rehabilitation instead of imprisonment. Most advocates are aware that while these actions have produced tangible results, they are not enough to fix the overarching structural problems created by and connected to the prison industrial complex. On the other end of the spectrum, you have activists and researchers who believe the answer lies in abolishing prisons and replacing them with institutions which focus on mental health and actual rehabilitation rather than punishment. The prison abolition movement has seen renewed interest in recent years as more people become aware of the injustices created by the current policing and court systems. This movement is made up of legal scholars, activists, former prisoners, and anarchists who believe systems of rehabilitation like those seen in Portugal could serve as a model for reworking the entire prison system. While it may seem far-fetched or even reckless to imagine the idea of a world without prisons or even police, it's important to acknowledge and address the web of problems created by the prison industrial complex. This system not only dehumanizes the prisoners, but it also dehumanizes the prison guards, the judges, the prosecutors, and all those who profit by normalizing the idea that humans can be caged for violations and made to suffer isolation, hunger, stress, and dangerous conditions. Until we are willing to look at this irrational situation and honestly seek solutions, millions of people from around the world will continue to suffer in cages. We must remember to question the authorities who dictate the laws to the people. Should we blindly trust their assessment of what is right and what is moral, and what is worthy of punishment and imprisonment? We ought to consider whether the current laws align with our values and our ideas of what is a violation of societal norms. We must question the mentality that says a person is irredeemable once they have made a mistake. Only once we have found the answers to these questions and sought to implement solutions which lift up all those suffering at the hands of this system, only then will we see an end to the prison industrial complex. To learn more about the prison industrial complex, we suggest reading Locked In: The True Causes of Mass Incarceration and How to Achieve Real Reform by John Pfaff, and The New Jim Crow: Mass Incarceration and the Age of Colorblindness by Michelle Alexander. Chapter 10: The Foundations and the Nonprofit Industrial Complex. In this series, we highlighted a number of examples of institutions which use their wealth and influence to exert real-world power as they shape the world to their liking. These institutions include nonprofits, think tanks, philanthropic organizations, charities, and non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, which ostensibly act in the interest of the public good. These institutions, what we will refer to as the foundations, are a part of what has recently come to be known as the nonprofit industrial complex. The nonprofit industrial complex has been referred to as the network of privatized nonprofits that provide social service, usually with financial aid from corporations and government. It can also be described as a system of relationships between the state, the ultra-wealthy, the foundations, and nonprofit NGOs, social service, and social justice organizations that result in the surveillance, control, derailment, and everyday management of political movements. These tax-exempt foundations leverage wealth to fund or create movements which will follow their dictates, whether consciously or unconsciously. What is the nonprofit industrial complex? The term was popularized by the book The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, a collection of essays by activists, educators, and nonprofit staff from around the world. The essays were gathered together by the Insight Collective. The organization, which describes itself as a collective of radical feminists of color, had first-hand experience learning that their revolution would not be funded. The organization took a trip to India with funding from the Ford Foundation and met many activist organizations who were accomplishing great things in their community without foundation grants. Quote, "When we saw that groups with much less access to resources were able to do amazing work without foundation funding, we began to question our reliance on foundation grants." This revelation led to the book The Revolution Will Not Be Funded and a 2004 conference which examined the history of nonprofits in an attempt to better understand how to organize in service of communities in need. These essays offer a wide range of criticisms of the nonprofit industrial complex, including that the government uses nonprofits to monitor and control social justice movements, diverts public monies into private hands through foundations, manages and controls political dissent, redirects activist energy into the nonprofit career rather than grassroots community organizing capable of actually transforming society, and allows corporations to mask their exploitative practices through so-called philanthropic work. Critics say that this world of foundations, masked as philanthropy, causes nonprofits to become more invested in the agenda of their benefactors rather than in the communities they claim to serve. Activists complain that once they join the world of the nonprofit industrial complex, they spend their time and energy writing grants, seeking money from big corporations and donors. Some activists feel this is the only way to get funding for projects, as opposed to continuously asking the community for funding. The first 8 chapters of our investigation has examined a number of these foundations which contribute to the nonprofit industrial complex. For example, we uncovered how the Rockefeller Foundation and their General Education Board, as well as the Carnegie Foundation, use their funds to shape the direction of education around the world. We saw that the Rockefeller Foundation shaped the direction of public health, and the Gates Foundation carry on this tradition, as seen by their immense influence on international health policy during the COVID-19 crisis. Finally, we also revealed how the Rockefeller Foundation has played an outsized role in designing the food systems around the world and continues to attempt to shape policy, as evidenced by their recent Reset the Table initiative. Remember that Reverend Frederick T. Gates, the business advisor to John D. Rockefeller Sr., who helped him found the Rockefeller General Education Board, wrote in his book, The Country School of Tomorrow, "In our dream, we have limitless resources, and the people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hand. The present educational conventions fade from our minds, and unhampered by tradition, we work our own good will upon a grateful and responsive rural folk. We shall not try to make these people or any of their children into philosophers or men of learning or of science. We are not to raise up among them authors, orators, poets, or men of letters. We shall not search embryo for great artists, painters, musicians, nor will we cherish even the humbler ambition to raise up among them lawyers, doctors, preachers, statesmen, of whom we now have ample supply. For the task we set before ourselves is very simple as well as a very beautiful one, to train these people as we find them to a perfectly ideal life just where they are. The Rockefeller funding of the General Education Board, later absorbed as part of the Rockefeller Foundation, was able to carefully craft education policy which achieved the goals of the foundation and not necessarily the goals of the teachers and parents. Just as Rockefeller and his network of philanthropic organizations sought to influence and shape the direction of public education, they also sought to influence medical schools across the country. While the Rockefeller family used the General Education Board to manipulate America's education system, they also created the International Education Board to invest their money into national and international universities and medical schools which focused on drug-based research. While the Rockefellers played a large role influencing the medical schools and universities, it was the assistance of the Carnegie family that helped transform the industry via their funding, the infamous Flexner Report. In 1905, steel billionaire Andrew Carnegie founded the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, or simply the Carnegie Foundation. The foundation was granted an official charter by the U.S. Congress in 1906, just as was done with the Rockefellers' General Education Board. The Rockefeller Foundation is still funding and guiding much of public health policy, but now they are joined by Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation. Gates has spent the last 2 decades mimicking the practices of the Rockefellers and ingratiating himself into nearly every aspect of global health. He is the #1 non-state funder of the World Health Organization, a huge contributor to Johns Hopkins University, the Wellcome Trust, and many other powerful health and medical organizations. Gates has continued the focus on treating symptoms of diseases and promoting vaccines. Together, the Gates and Rockefeller families and their partners in pharmaceutical firms are using the COVID-19 crisis as an opportunity to cement themselves as the de facto leaders and policymakers, despite not being employed by the governments who follow their orders. We have also outlined how the Rockefeller Foundation funded the so-called Green Revolution and the push for dangerous pesticides and genetically engineered foods. In 1943, Norman Borlaug, a plant geneticist, and his team of researchers traveled to Mexico and jump-started this shift. Borlaug was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation and the Ford Foundation. The actions taken by the Ford, Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Gates Foundations perfectly illustrate the problems of the nonprofit industrial complex. Now, we must examine the role played by non-governmental organizations. NGOs as weapons of control. Non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, are defined as organizations independent from government, typically a non-profit, serving some sort of humanitarian cause. Now, it should be obvious that not every NGO, think tank, or foundation is working against the will of the people. However, without a doubt, there are examples of these institutions being used to push agendas of foreign governments or militaries. Let's focus on the National Endowment for Democracy, or NED, and the United States Agency for International Development, or USAID. These organizations purport to be independent of government and only serving philanthropic causes, but history bears out a much different reality. Both USAID and the NED have been linked to countless regime change efforts abroad, including Egypt in 2013 and Ukraine in 2014. Journalist Tony Cartolucci reports on the deep ties between the NED and the national security apparatus. Quote, "But the NED board of directors includes many other characters with open ties to corrupt corporate financier interests and proven track records of eagerly promoting war and enabling US-backed regime change around the globe. The National Endowment for Democracy is using the promotion of democracy as the smokescreen while engaged in political interference and regime change abroad in the pursuit of serving the corporate interests represented by the board of directors and those who fund NED directly. The NED was created as a non-profit corporation via funding from USAID, which has also been accused of being a tool for conducting activities favorable to the Central Intelligence Agency under the guise of providing foreign aid. Both organizations have been involved in funding activist movements in countries which do not align with US policy. The concept of the endowment took shape as the country moved from the dark self-doubts after the Vietnam War into the new era of confidence in its own virtues and a conviction that democracy should be supported publicly and proudly without the secrecy that tainted the CIA's activities. "We should not have to do this kind of work covertly," said Carl Gershman, president of the endowment, who was an aide to Jean J. Kirkpatrick when she was the chief United States delegate to the United Nations. "It would be terrible for democratic groups around the world to be seen as subsidized by the CIA. We saw that in the 1960s, and that's why it has been discontinued. We have not had the capability of doing this, and that's why the endowment was created." Mr. Gershman says that there is no contact between the CIA and the endowment, and that before grants are made, a list of the potential recipients is sent by the endowment through the State Department to the CIA to be sure none of them are getting covert funds. As part of a 2010 investigation by ProPublica, Paul Steger, then editor-in-chief of the outlet, said, quote, "Those who spearheaded creation of NED have long acknowledged it was part of an effort to move from the covert to overt efforts to foster democracy." Steger cited a 1991 interview with then-President Alan Weinstein as evidence. In the interview, Weinstein stated, quote, "A lot of what we do today was done covertly 25 years ago by the CIA. The biggest difference, the flat potential is close to zero. Openness is its own protection." Critics have long compared U.S. aid and NED funding Nicaraguan groups in the 1980s and 90s to the efforts of the CIA to overthrow governments throughout Latin America in the 1950s and 60s. Now that we have a deeper understanding of the nonprofit industrial complex and the ways in which NGOs can be tools for regime change, we need to take a deeper look into the past to find the origins of these intersecting issues. The origins of the nonprofit industrial complex. In April 1954, the 82nd U.S. Congress convened the Select Committee to investigate tax-exempt foundations and comparable organizations, known as the Reese Committee, to study foundations to see if they were involved in, quote, un-American and subversive activities for political purposes, propaganda, or attempts to influence legislation. The committee was led by Representative Carol Reese and focused on investigating the big foundations of the day, including the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the Carnegie Foundation. The final report of the committee was submitted by Chief Investigator Norman Dodd, who stated that these foundations were funding projects at Columbia, Harvard, University of Chicago, and University of California with the goal of promoting oligarchical collectivism. Before we dive deeper into the conclusions of the Reese Committee, it's important to note that this investigation was the third investigation of its type over a period of 40 years. The Walsh Commission, also known as the Commission on Industrial Relations, studied industrial work conditions throughout the United States between 1913 and 1915. In 1916, the Walsh Commission published an 11-volume report with tens of thousands of pages of testimony from a wide range of witnesses, including Henry Ford, Andrew Carnegie, and John D. Rockefeller Jr. While the report was focused on the issue of labor exploitation, it also looked at concentrations of economic power and the role of charitable foundations and being used as instruments of power concentration. Luis D. Brandeis, a lawyer who served as an associate justice on the U.S. Supreme Court from 1916 to 1939, testified that he was gravely concerned with the growth of the foundations. Brandeis testified that the foundation's power had grown into a state within the state, quote, so powerful that the ordinary social and industrial forces existing are insufficient to cope with it. He said this system of foundations was, quote, inconsistent with our democratic aspirations. During John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s testimony, he was asked about the power of foundations to influence independent thought and action. Rockefeller said influencing the public was possible, but there should be no public restrictions on the foundations. He called for academic freedom and complete independence and the use of funds given to educational institutions. In response to this, Chairman Frank Walsh warned that granting of funds for schools might result in, quote, persons being educated to take the viewpoint, consciously or unconsciously, of the man or the foundation that gave the money. The final report of the Walsh Commission concluded, quote, as regarded the foundations, created for unlimited general purposes and endowed with enormous resources, their ultimate possibilities are so grave a menace, not only as regards their own activities and influence, but also the benumbing effect which they have on private citizens and public bodies, that if they could be clearly differentiated from other forms of voluntary altruistic effort, it would be desirable to recommend their abolition. Unfortunately, the recommendations were not followed, and another committee was convened in 1952, 2 years before the Reese Committee. This select committee to investigate tax-exempt foundations and comparable organizations, also known as the Cox Committee, named after Representative Edward E. Cox, also investigated the foundations. The Cox Committee was rather limited in scope and resources. Thus, in 1954, the committee was revived by Representative Carol Reese. Attorney Rene Wormser was a general counsel to the Reese Committee. He drafted the final majority report of the committee and published his findings in the 1958 book, Foundations, Their Power and Influence. In the preface to the book, Representative Reese wrote that the obstacles to the committee included, quote, the influential liberal press characterized by the New York Times, the New York Herald Tribune, and the Washington Post-Times Herald, who he said threw their editorial power against the committee. Reese also said that, quote, the bulk of the conservative press could not be unmindful of the enormous power of these foundations. Reese warned that the, quote, group of prominent men whose decisions would have to be judged by the committee's investigation extended even to the intimates of the White House. Reese said that the investigation revealed, quote, an unparalleled amount of power is concentrated increasingly in the hands of an interlocking and self-perpetuating group. Reese notes that a 1954 article in the New York Daily News reported that the committee had the, quote, almost impossible task of telling the taxpayers that the huge fortunes piled up by such industrial giants as John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and Henry Ford were today being used to destroy or discredit the free enterprise system which gave them birth. In his book, Mr. Wormser outlines how the Reese Committee used primary sources of foundation grants such as the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the Carnegie Corporation of New York, and examined secondary distributors of grant money, especially organizations such as the Social Science Research Council, the Institute of Pacific Relations, and the American Council on Education, which are supported by the major foundations. The investigation therefore included colleges, hospitals, churches, and other institutions which were recipients of money from foundations. The committee divided the organizations into 3 groups: those which are purely granting foundations, those which use their money for their own research and operations, known as operating foundations, and those which might be called intermediaries, clearinghouses, or retailers for other foundations. These charitable tax exemptions were intended to advance the public welfare by offering exemption for philanthropic purposes. Wormser notes that, quote, the increasing tax burden on income and estates has greatly accelerated a trend towards creation of foundations as instruments for the retention of control over capital assets that would otherwise be lost. In other words, from the very beginning of the creation of these foundations, very wealthy families were using them to avoid taxes, redistribute their wealth, and influence the public. Some of our largest foundations, established before the introduction of federal income and estate taxes, were created largely to glamorize a name not previously identified as conspicuously charitable, Wormser wrote. For example, Wormser notes that if the Ford family hadn't created a foundation, they would have been forced to sell a large part of their ownership of the Ford company to pay hundreds of millions of dollars in estate taxes they would be expected to pay upon the deaths of Henry and Edsel Ford. By creating a foundation, they were able to escape estate taxes on 90% of their fortune and retain voting control of the company. The investigation also dug into the then emerging field of social sciences and the ways in which the foundations were influencing education and political affairs. Quote, it is in the fields of education, international affairs, and what are called the social sciences that the greatest damage can be done to our society. For this reason, the Reese Committee confined its inquiry almost entirely to these areas, Reese wrote. In the end, Wormser believed the main contribution of the committee was to, quote, expose instances in which the promotion of political ends favored by foundation managers had been disguised as charitable or educational activity. When the report was finally released to the public, it was largely ignored or derided. Critics accused the committee of falling into paranoia and wasting time and money. Most major media failed to report on the actual conclusions of the Reese Committee and their warnings of attempts to promote oligarchical collectivism. The only journalist who bothered to report on the topic in a substantial manner was G. Edward Griffin. Griffin is known for his work exposing the Federal Reserve System and the medical cartel. Griffin interviewed Norman Dodd, who was the Congressional Director of Research for the Reese Committee, regarding his work for the committee and the final report.
I came across this one document on the topic of tax-exempt foundations and their association with the Soviet Union shortly after World War II, And when I say association with the Soviet Union, I shouldn't say that. Their association with the Soviet ideology. I thought, what? Well, this didn't make sense to me. But as I read, I discovered, oh my gosh, there was a lot of interesting history there that I didn't know. And in particular, it was the history to the effect that after the end of World War II, some of the largest tax-exempt foundations, like the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, for one, and the Ford Foundation, were publishing tracts written by Joseph Stalin and other communist writers and theoreticians, basically saying that the future belongs to communism and that capitalism must be destroyed or put to rest, replaced. And here were these giant tax-exempt foundations publishing these things and financing groups that were promoting these doctrines. And it naturally it upset a lot of people. William Randolph Hearst was one of them. And I didn't know any of this was going on, but Hearst even put a lot of front page editorials on his newspapers, headlines on the page about the communist influence of tax-exempt foundations. And who is this guy Stalin? Who are we? Why are we supposed to be following Stalin and so forth? So there was a public outcry as to what's going on with these tax-exempt foundations promoting communist propaganda. I didn't know that. But anyway, that was what happened, and that led to the formation of this investigative committee into tax-exempt foundations. And so that's where I got into the scene. I was reading about that in these government documents put out by the House Committee on Un-American Activities, and that's where I saw Norman Dodd's name. Now, Norman Dodd was the chief investigator for that Reese committee.
That what we had uncovered was the determination of these large endowed foundations through their trustees to actually get control over the content of American education.
There's quite a bit of publicity given to your conversation with Rowan Gaither. Would you please tell us who he was and what was that conversation you had with him?
Rowan Gaither was at that time president of the Ford Foundation. Mr. Gaither said, Mr. Dodd, we've asked you to come up here today because we thought that possibly off the record you would tell us why the Congress is interested in the activities of foundations such as ourselves. Before I could think of how I would reply to that statement, Mr. Gaither then went on voluntarily and stated, he said, Mr. Dodd, all of us that have a hand in the making of policies here have had experience either with the OSS during the war or the European Economic Administration after the war. We've had experience operating under directives, and these directives emanate and did emanate from the White House. Now we still operate under just such directives. Would you like to know what the substance of these directives is? And I said, yes, Mr. Gaither, I'd like very much to know. Whereupon he made this statement to me, namely, Mr. Dodd, we are here operate on in response to similar directives, the substance of which is that we shall use our grant-making power so to alter life in the United States that it can be comfortably merged with the Soviet Union. Well, parenthetically, Mr. Griffin, I nearly fell off the chair. I, of course, didn't, but my response to Mr. Gaither then was, well, Mr. Gaither, I can now answer your first question. You forced the Congress of the United States to spend $150,000 to find out what you just told me. So why don't you I said, of course, legally you're entitled to make grants for this purpose, but I don't think you're entitled to withhold that information from the people of the country to whom you're indebted for your tax exemption. So why don't you tell the people of the country that's what you told me? And his answer was, we would not think of doing any such thing. So then I said, well, Mr. Gaither, obviously, you forced the Congress to spend this money in order to find out what you've just told me.
As disturbing as the revelations exposed by Dodd, Reese, and Griffin were, they are not the only dark truths related to nonprofits and foundations. The Round Table Groups. In an upcoming episode of this series, we will tackle the issue of so-called secret societies. But for the moment, let's take a look at claims that certain public-facing nonprofits and foundations actually operate as representatives for groups which operate in the shadows. These groups, commonly known as roundtable groups, were first outlined by American historian and former Georgetown University professor Dr. Carroll Quigley in his book Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time. In the book, Quigley outlines the history of Western civilization from 1860 to 1963. However, Quigley's version of events is based on the archives of the Council on Foreign Relations, one of America's oldest foundations which worked to steer international political affairs. In Tragedy and Hope, as well as the book The Anglo-American Establishment, Quigley outlines how a secret group was seeking to shape American policy to bring it back under the control of the fading British Empire. Forensic historian Richard Grove, host of the Grand Theft World podcast and creator of the Tragedy and Hope website, has been studying the roundtable groups and the work of Carroll Quigley for over a decade.
So around the 1860s, 1880s, right after our Civil War, there's a lot of people in Britain who are lamenting the loss of America. There's I have a Pilgrim Society book here, and it cites Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote the Sherlock Holmes series. He's saying he actually had a plan for an Anglo-American partnership and these sort of things. And around that same time in Oxford, there's a professor named John Ruskin. Ruskin has this philosophy about the English-speaking idea and how it should rule the world. And if you want to look at the origins of institutionalized racism, I mean, there's a 1,000-year-old college of the British Empire that's been promoting it around the world for centuries. I don't know why they don't talk about it on their networks. But so Ruskin has this student, Cecil Rhodes, who takes all this stuff super seriously. And Rhodes is interesting. His older brother, is already in South Africa, gold mining, I think, right? Maybe it was gold, maybe it was diamonds. He's already down there. And Rhodes didn't go to Oxford yet, but he gets a line of credit from Lord Rothschild to go down on Rothschild's behalf to get into mining in South Africa. So he goes down, he gets with his brother finds there's another wildcat hotspot. He's leaving as soon as he gets there. He starts buying up other people's mines. He buys up the pump equipment and lets their mines flood out, and then they'll sell it, and then he can go in and pump it out, and now they got another mine. And eventually he goes back to Britain to go to Oxford to be more official in his dealings for the Rothschilds. He comes back down. They create De Beers Consolidated Mines. De Beers was a farmer. And so Rhodes takes that farmer's operation along with a whole bunch of others that he organized, and he's basically prototyping a colony for the British Empire.
This history highlights how British miner and South African politician Cecil Rhodes worked with Alfred Milner in 1891 to found what would come to be known as the Roundtable Groups. The facilitation and directing of these groups would change hands over the years, but it was the death of Rhodes and his wills which created the Rhodes Scholarship Program at Oxford University, which has been used as a method to recruit new members of the roundtables and disseminate their ideas and accomplish their goals internationally. Using the roundtable group strategy, this loose organization of powerful interests operated with a hidden inner circle and a public outer circle. Many members of the roundtable groups have participated in the Rhodes Scholar Program before going on to positions of power and influence in government, finance, media, and the private sector. The groups include the Royal Institute of International Affairs, also known as Chatham House, the aforementioned Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, and more recently, groups like the World Economic Forum. While most of the groups Quigley mentions tend to be associated with the left wing of American politics, there are also secretive organizations which carry a conservative focus, including the Council for National Policy, which has also been compared to the Council on Foreign Relations. Tragedy and Hope also discussed the role of the leaders of central banks of several nations and how the international banking cartel plays a major role in shaping public policy. We will explore this claim in an upcoming episode of this series. While Quigley did criticize certain interpretations of his work, he also openly acknowledged that there was a conspiracy at work. In Tragedy and Hope, Quigley writes, quote, "This radical right fairy tale, which is now an accepted folk myth in many groups in America, pictured the recent history of the United States in regard to domestic reform and in foreign affairs as a well-organized plot by extreme left-wing elements. This myth, like all fables, does in fact have a modicum of truth. There does exist, and has existed for a generation, an international Anglophile network which operates, to some extent, in the way the radical right believes the communists act. In fact, this network, which we may identify as the roundtable groups, has no aversion to cooperating with the communists or any other group, and frequently does so. I know of the operation of this network because I have studied it for 20 years and was permitted for 2 years in the early 1960s to examine its papers and secret records. I have no aversion to it or most of its aims, and have, for much of my life, been close to it and to many of its instruments. I have objected both in the past and recently to a few of its policies, but in general, my chief difference of opinion is that it wishes to remain unknown, and I believe its role in history is significant enough to be known."
So what Rhodes is doing down there is he's fulfilling the John Ruskin, Oxfordian, English-speaking idea world government part, but he's also meeting the ideas and needs of the Freemasons. And as we'll learn soon, he also helped to meet the needs of the Zionists. And once you combine those groups together, there's a whole lot of people working against America that America never really took a look at, and sometimes aids as their partners. So Rhodes, he dies at like age 40 or 41. He dies in 1902. And he's famous for having had many last wills and testaments. So there's various versions. He wrote his first one at Oxford under Ruskin, and he carried it around in his jacket along with one of Ruskin's speeches on the English-speaking idea. And then he went through various other versions. In the earlier versions, he's giving his great deal of wealth back to Lord Rothschild, who sponsored him. Makes a lot of sense. Then there was a little scrutiny on that, so they took Rothschild off of like being the executor or the recipient, and they put Lord Rosebery, Lord Rothschild's son-in-law. He's got a different last name. Let's put him in there, right? And so it's published in 1902 when he dies as the last will and testament of Cecil John Rhodes, with elucidatory notes to which some chapters are added by the author because he was Rhodes's friend. They came up with the plan together. So the guy who wrote the book, William T. Stead, was in charge of the review of reviews, was a big roundtable hub in Britain. And he and Rhodes had come up with the idea for the British Empire to take America back into it. And for the purposes of doing that, to create a secret society and a group of scholarships that would Anglicize Americans and others around the world into the English-speaking idea, so that Rhodes's idea had funding, it had an academic aspect, it had a secret society aspect, and it was to be modeled on the Jesuits and replace Roman Empire with Catholic Church, or with a British Empire. Roman Catholic religion with British Empire is one of the quotes. So now it's not just Tragedy and Hope telling you about Rhodes. You got his last will and testament, and you can go out on your own and verify.
More than 70 years has passed since the warnings from Norman Dodd, Carol Reese, and the Walsh Commission, and more than 50 years since Carroll Quigley exposed the roundtable groups. Needless to say, the warnings were not heeded, and the power of the foundations and the roundtable groups has only grown and become more influential on the public. However, in that time, the public has become even more ignorant to the ways in which these organizations influence and shape our world. The Gates Foundation is now one of the largest and most influential foundations, and the Rockefellers continue to hold massive sway. What will it take to break the hold that these corrupt institutions have on the minds of the masses? Solutions. If we aim to break free from the grip of the foundations and the nonprofit industrial complex, we need to rethink the way we do activism and charity. As noted from the activists in the book, The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, working within the nonprofit or philanthropic space in the hopes of bettering your community or improving the world is a noble venture, but it might not always produce the results you desire. If your activism is solely based on working within these structures, we highly encourage you to recognize that grassroots activism outside of the nonprofit sector can be equally valuable. While the community may not have the millions of dollars that the foundations offer, there are many exciting opportunities to fund projects and accomplish goals. For example, in 2015, I had the opportunity to visit Detroit and learn about the community crowdfunding and microfinancing program known as Detroit Soup. For $5, attendees gain entry to an event with music, homemade soup, and 4 presentations from local community members. The presentations are focused on projects which could empower the local community directly. The attendees listen to the presentation, enjoy a bowl of soup, and then vote on their favorite project. At the end of the evening, the project with the most votes is awarded the collected money to help them achieve their goals. This project has inspired other cities to take up similar efforts. When it comes to the large foundations which use their wealth and influence to manipulate our worlds, we ought to consider ending any financial support of these foundations, as well as any of their beneficiary organizations. If any organization is taking money from the foundations, educate them about the dangers posed by these organizations, and make it clear you will not support them if they take money from these dangerous foundations. If you do desire to contribute to charitable or philanthropic organizations, do your research. Investigate the organizations you are considering supporting and find out about their business relationships, their projects, and the ways in which they use their funds. For starters, you can visit the World Economic website and check their partners page to see if you are supporting any of the foundations serving their agendas. In an upcoming episode, we will dive deeper as we explore what is exactly meant by oligarchical collectivism. But for now, let's remember that with all pieces of this pyramid, we need to take personal responsibility. We need to make a diligent effort to be aware of what we are supporting with our dollars and time. If we blindly continue to support these foundations under the assumption that they are doing some good in the world, we are only hurting ourselves, and we only have ourselves to blame. To learn more about the foundations, the nonprofit industrial complex, and the roundtable groups, we recommend reading Foundations, Their Power and Influence by Renee A. Wormser. The Revolution Will Not Be Funded Behind the Nonprofit Industrial Complex by Insight, and Tragedy and Hope and the Anglo-American Establishment by Carol Quigley. Chapter 11: The Banking Cartel. Nearly every aspect of the pyramid of power which has been mentioned thus far is touched by the banking industry. Whether we are talking about the education system, the prison system, Hollywood, or the average person storing their savings in a bank, the world of finance pervades every aspect of our lives. The influence of the banks can be seen via loans, investments, or simply holding money. The fact is that our lives are impacted by the banks directly and indirectly every single day.
We begin tonight with another staggering report on inflation.
A hike sure to be felt in the wallets of American borrowers.
The US Central Bank is battling to tamp down on raging inflation.
Index shows inflation rose.
More experts are increasing the likelihood of a recession in the near future.
The purpose of this investigation will be to briefly explore the history of banking and the role the banks and the people behind them have played in shaping our world over the last centuries. Because of the nearly universal use of banking institutions, it is of vital importance that we understand how the bankers influence our lives and whether we prefer to allow this influence to exist in the first place. We will also examine the latest trends in banking and how they signal the shift of our world into a new digital era. First, let's take a look at the history of banking itself. Archaeological findings indicate record-keeping of transactions and the use of grain and animals as a form of currency as far back as 5000 BC in Sumeria, as well as the ancient Greece and Roman periods. Around this time, it was common for wealth to be stored at temples and palaces of different kingdoms. Much of what was stored at these temples was gold and coins of varying size and metals. Wealthy aristocrats would store their coins and jewels in the basements of temples, which often made temples a target during wars and invasions. Documents have been discovered which detail how banking should be handled, including the Code of Hammurabi, a Babylonian legal text estimated to have been completed between 1755 and 1750 BC, which deals with many topics including loans. However, it was the Holy Roman Empire which began to lay the foundation for a more modern form of banking. The Roman Empire began to formalize the administrative aspect of banking, including greater regulation of banking institutions. With the fall of the empire, the Roman banking system came to an end. Around the 12th century, we began to see the emergence of merchant banks, commercial banks operated by wealthy Italian families from Florence, Venice, and Genoa. Throughout the 15th and 16th centuries, banks began to emerge in Italy, Spain, Holland, and Germany. It was around the 17th century where we start to see banking concepts such as fractional reserve banking, a system of banking now used all over the world, which allows banks to hold only a small portion of the funds deposited by their customers while they invest the rest of the money into various projects and financial schemes. It was also around this point that the wealthy merchant class began to store their gold with goldsmiths in London. These goldsmiths would hold the gold in private vaults and charge a fee for the service. The goldsmiths would then issue receipts for the quantity and purity of the metal. This would eventually lead to the goldsmiths lending out money and a further development of modern banking. The Rothschild banking dynasty. The merchant banking family steadily grew in wealth and power. One of the most powerful families was the infamous Rothschilds. The family was led by a German Jewish man named Amschel Moses Rothschild. Amschel lived in the Jewish ghetto of Frankfurt, Germany. Amschel would have 8 children, including Meyer Amschel Rothschild, the founder of the Rothschild banking dynasty, and often touted as the founding father of international finance. Like his father, Meyer Rothschild was involved in currency exchange. The younger Rothschild secured an apprenticeship under Jacob Wolf Oppenheimer, learning foreign trade and expanding his knowledge of currency exchange. He would eventually become a dealer in rare coins and the personal supplier of coins to Crown Prince Wilhelm of Hesse. In 1769, Meyer Rothschild gained the title of court Jew or court factor, and his business would expand to include other royal accounts across Europe. The true wealth and influence of the Rothschild family would be seen in Meyer Rothschild's children, specifically his 5 sons. In what has been labeled the 5 arrows approach, Meyer sent his 5 sons to different parts of Europe to establish banking institutions. This spreading of Rothschild influence and wealth has greatly impacted Europe and the world at large. Eldest son Amschel Meyer took over duties for the Frankfurt Bank. Salomon Meyer Rothschild handled the banking business in Vienna, Austria. Cowman Karl Meyer Rothschild established a bank in Naples, Italy. Jacob Meyer de Rothschild became a banking giant in Paris, France. This bank funded Napoleon and became one of the leading banks in European finance. The French Rothschild banking family funded France's major wars and colonial expansion. Finally, Nathan Meyer Rothschild established N.M. Rothschild & Sons and turned it into one of Europe's most powerful banking institutions. In 1835, he secured a contract with the Spanish government, giving him the rights to the mines in southern Spain and establishing a near monopoly on mercury in Europe. The 5 brothers coordinated their activities across Europe and developed a network of shippers, couriers, and spies. It is often claimed that this private intelligence service enabled Nathan to receive news of Duke Wellington's victory against Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo a full day ahead of the government's official messengers. This advanced knowledge reportedly allowed the Rothschilds to profit off the outcome of the Battle of Waterloo by using this information to speculate on the London Stock Exchange and make a vast fortune, estimated to be in the hundreds of millions of dollars at the time. The Rothschild family archives acknowledge that Nathan did indeed have early knowledge of Napoleon's defeat and did use the information to make a large profit. However, they dispute the amount of money made, claiming that at most, Nathan profited a couple $1 million. Regardless, it's quite obvious that the Rothschild family has played a major role in the development of international banking in the last couple hundred years. One powerful example of this is the partnership between Nathan's N.M. Rothschild & Sons and the Bank of England, the central bank of the UK. The fact that central banks and national governments were indebted to the Rothschild family should illustrate the power they wielded. The relationship between the Bank of England and the Rothschilds continued when Nathan Meyer's grandson, Alfred de Rothschild, became a director of the Bank of England in 1869. In order to gain a deeper understanding of the role played by the bankers, we need to understand the central banking system, especially the Federal Reserve System. The Federal Reserve and central banking. When it comes to the United States Federal Reserve System, once again, G. Edward Griffin was one of the earliest journalists to report on the factual history of the founding of America's central bank. In 1994, Griffin published his widely acclaimed book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, A Second Look at the Federal Reserve.
I wanted to produce a film on inflation. All I knew about inflation was that what we were being told, as usual, was not true. And so I started to gather books and things and did some interviews. And I was going to produce a documentary film on the cause of inflation. And I discovered that it was an institution called the Federal Reserve System. It was a central bank, as they like to call it. I didn't know much about it, except I knew that those were the culprits because they were creating money literally as they wished. There was no limit to the amount they could create, it seemed. So they were creating money faster than goods and services were being created. And if you put the money supply ahead of the actual goods and services that are available for it, well, that inflates or deflates the value of the money and inflates the prices. And I decided that this topic was much bigger than I had ever dreamed in the early days. Every time I learned something, would open up another door to another room, and you go into that room and say, gee, I didn't know about this. And there are 3 more doors in the back of that room, and you open up each one into another room. And the thing grew and grew until finally I realized that this topic of money and the effect it has on civilization, the effect it has on a culture, the effect it was having on my future and my children's future was profound. And I had no knowledge of it as a young person. I decided I've got to write a book about this. Well, I never considered myself a writer. I was a public speaker, right? I gave speeches. I don't write books. I don't know how to do that. But I decided I had to write a book. So I started to write the book that probably more people have heard about rather than me. I mean, my name, the book is more well known as The Creature from Jekyll Island, a second look at the Federal Reserve.
In his book, Griffin outlines a meeting between influential bankers and politicians at Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia. The discussions taking place at the meeting eventually led to the creation of the Federal Reserve. While Griffin was not the first to report on the secret meeting, at the time of publication of his book, much of the mainstream press dismissed the idea as conspiracy theory. Regardless, even the Federal Reserve itself has come to acknowledge and commemorate the meeting. The meeting was organized by U.S. Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island. Aldrich's daughter Abigail was married to John D. Rockefeller Jr., son of Standard Oil founder John D. Rockefeller Sr. As mentioned in Chapter 1, Big Education, in 1903, Aldrich helped establish the Rockefellers' General Education Board, which allowed that family to reshape the trajectory of public schooling. Aldrich also led the efforts to reform the monetary system into a mechanism which would allow the bankers to gain even greater influence over the economy, and thus the people. Aldrich served as the chair of the National Monetary Commission to study the causes of the Panic of 1907. In this role, he drew up the Aldrich Plan, which would eventually influence the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 and the establishment of the Federal Reserve System. However, before the passing of the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, Aldrich was meeting with an elite group of bankers at the Jekyll Island Club in 1910. Regular members of the club included the banking houses of the day, the Morgans, Rockefellers, Warburgs, and Vanderbilts. In fact, the Federal Reserve website says it was likely John Pierpont Morgan, otherwise known as J.P. Morgan, who arranged for the group to use the club for the meeting. Those in attendance include A. Piatt Andrew, the U.S. Assistant Treasury Secretary, Frank Vanderlip, president of the National City Bank of New York, Henry P. Davison, a senior partner of J.P. Morgan Company, Benjamin Strong Jr., an associate of J.P. Morgan and president of Bankers Trust Co., and Paul Warburg of the Warburg banking family. It was at this meeting that a plan was hatched to introduce a central banking system which the banks would own. This was the establishment of the banks into a banking cartel with full control of the money supply. Once the men in attendance had their orders, they returned to their spheres of influence to bring the vision to life. Within 3 years of the Jekyll Island meeting, the United States had a new central bank, and the era of inflation and an ever-increasing income tax began. 100 years after the establishment of the Federal Reserve System, journalist James Corbett released his documentary, The Century of Enslavement. In his documentary, Corbett expands upon the work done by G. Edward Griffin to show that the same banking families who have been controlling finance for centuries are the same people controlling the private banks who actually control the Federal Reserve System.
The power to print the money is control over nations. the person who is, or the people who are ultimately in control of the money supply are the ones that are dictating the policies of that country. And I think the prime example of this is the drive to create the third central bank in U.S. history, the Federal Reserve, back at the turn of the 20th century. Because it was recognized by the people that there was a serious problem. Bank runs were becoming more and more destabilizing of the economy. Something had to be done. So the bankers got in front of that parade and conspired in an open conspiracy that is part of the historical record now that we know about on Jekyll Island in 1910 to formulate the idea that would eventually be passed as the Federal Reserve Act. And it is no coincidence that the Federal Reserve Act was passed in 1913. Immediately we got an income tax, and America was driven into World War I. World War I was financed with help from the new monetary functions of the newly created Federal Reserve, and which greatly expanded monetary control over the foreign policy decisions of any would-be administration. Of course, Woodrow Wilson was not exactly an unwilling participant in that drive for war, although he claimed to be. But at any rate, it was the Federal Reserve's consolidation of control in 1913 that made the U.S. entry into World War I in 1917 possible. The obvious takeaway from this is that the centralized control over not just the economy, but the monetary system itself that a central bank like the Federal Reserve represents, the mechanism by which that control is effected. So in order to break that control, one would have to break the central bank. It is the central bank itself which has control and the power over the money supply to print money in the interest of this agenda, but not in the interest of that agenda, in the interest of the agenda of the people who have the power over the printing press. That is the key to the control over the system as it exists. And that's why it's so incredibly important that people understand something about the monetary system and the way that money is created in the current system.
In the decades since the release of The Creature from Jekyll Island, a worldwide movement exposing the Federal Reserve System sprung up around the United States, largely thanks to two presidential campaigns by former U.S. Congressman Ron Paul of Texas. Paul ran for president in 2008 and 2012 with a focus on civil liberties, ending the wars, and exposing the dangers of the Federal Reserve System. He authored bills seeking to audit and end the Federal Reserve System, which received very little mainstream political support. This was also around the time of the burgeoning Tea Party movement in the United States. Despite the mainstream media's best attempts to silence the movement behind Ron Paul, he was extremely popular on college campuses and with veterans who resonated with his anti-war stance. Paul's book, In the Fed, built on the work of G. Edward Griffin and made the case for shuttering the financial institution. The books, presidential campaigns, and speeches helped inspire a new generation of activists focused on ending the influence of bankers on American politics. For several years in the early 2010s, activists around the United States held marches and rallies at the Federal Reserve banks across the country. Also around this time, Americans were in the early days of recovering from the 2008 financial crisis, which was also caused by these same banks. People all around the world were impacted by the shady decisions made by the bankers. As people lost their homes and their savings, they began to look for answers. In September 2011, activists launched the Occupy Wall Street movement in New York City's Zuccotti Park. Within a month, there were similar Occupy protests taking place in hundreds of cities across the United States and in more than 900 cities in 82 countries. The activists in each city had a varying list of demands, but by and large, people were upset about the power and influence of financial institutions on their lives. Some were specifically focused on the use of subprime loans, which played a major role in the 2008 financial crisis. And many were outraged that the big banks were seen as too big to fail, while the taxpayer was left to pay the cost of the crisis. Some participants also focused on getting money out of politics, while others were focused on inequality in housing and jobs. Overall, while the movements had stark differences, they also had similar objectives. In fact, some members of the End the Fed movement launched an Occupy the Fed campaign with hopes of inspiring people to occupy the Federal Reserve banks around the country. Unfortunately, alliances between the Tea Party, End the Fed, and Occupy crowds were rare. As with many activist movements, it wasn't long before the original messages of the Tea Party and Occupy were watered down, co-opted, and eventually shut down. In the case of Occupy, all of the encampments around the world had been cleared from the parks by January 2012. The Tea Party movement was quickly diluted and swallowed up by the mainstream Republican Party, and Ron Paul's End the Fed movement mostly died with his failed second presidential run. While there are still many people who support Ron Paul and his call to end the Federal Reserve, the issue has taken a backseat in the age of culture wars.
One of the most remarkable things of the past decade was witnessing the rise of Occupy Wall Street on one end of the phony left-right spectrum and End the Fed / the Tea Party movement on the other side of the controlled left-right spectrum. And these two movements, at base, the core of what these two movements were and what the original activists involved in those movements were advocating for, were very similar in a lot of key respects. These were not highly politically partisan movements at their base at the beginning. They were quickly taken over and co-opted and deflected by the old political partisan hacks in order to deflect them from the core issue that was at the base of both. Occupy Wall Street and the Fed were both trying to target the banking system and the monetary system, which became an issue that I think Ron Paul acted as the lightning rod for that issue in the 2008 political election cycle in the United States. But that was a recognition, especially during the time of the 2008 banking crisis, that there is something fundamentally wrong with the system as it has been structured. And that realization is truly one of the most revolutionary potentialities that certainly in U.S. history, but really in world history, when the population starts to become highly interested in the monetary question, that is when things get very politically volatile. We can look back to the populist movement at the late 19th, early 20th century in the United States that was advocating for bimetallism, recognizing that the gold standard that the U.S. was on at that time was actually the cross of gold in William Jennings Bryan's famous formulation, to which the public would be nailed. And people were arguing, for example, for free silver, and this would be the way to open up the monetary base and so that the average person could participate. That kind of insight is truly revolutionary, and that's why the populist movement of the turn of the 20th century had to be denigrated, and that's why the populist movements of the 21st century were quickly derailed and basically scuttled off into side issues. So it is extremely important that the populist movements of the 21st century started out fundamentally questioning the monetary base on which our society functions. And obviously, I don't think this takes much reasoning. I think we can quickly understand exactly why the people in charge of this system would want to deflect people from pursuing that avenue of inquiry.
The Federal Reserve System is the model for many of the central banks around the world today. In fact, the vast majority of nations in the world operate within the central banking system. Forensic historian Richard Grove explains how the Rothschilds exported the central banking system around the world and eventually played a role in the creation of the international financial organizations like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the Bank for International Settlements.
Like, the royalty was thousands of years old power, but this new central bank thing was a whole new thing, and they needed money over there at the royal place. A whole bunch of other countries needed money too. And so this group had figured it out. They got this international banking, I don't want to call it a cartel, but it's a dynasty. Now, they started in Germany, and they closed down their German office a couple years before World War I. So during World War I, no Rothschild. In fact, I don't think the bank opened until later in the 20th century back in Germany. So they kind of spread out. And in the time that they spread out, you had the immediate creation here in this country of the Federal Reserve System. And then around the time of World War II, you had the Bank for International Settlements, which was Montague Norman from the Bank of England and Helmar Horace Greeley Schacht, who was Hitler's banker, but he was born in Brooklyn. That's the Bank for International Settlements in Switzerland. And from there, they create the IMF, the World Bank. But these are all creatures, not just from Jekyll Island. These are creatures of Rhodes's last will and testament. So the working groups, the media control, the financial control, it's been conglomerated, distilled, and condensed over the last 120 120 years since Rhodes died.
With the launch of the Bretton Woods system in 1944, two organizations were created, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Ostensibly, these globalist organizations loan out funds to impoverished or developing nations in the name of defeating poverty or exporting democracy. However, as noted in the book Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins, these institutions often hand out loans to nations with the intent of seizing the natural resources and minerals if a nation cannot repay the debt. The World Bank itself has been dominated by international bankers and members of the roundtable groups, including the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission. In the wake of World War I, another powerful institution was created in Basel, Switzerland, the Bank for International Settlements, the central bank of central banks. The BIS was originally created to process the World War I reparations from Germany. The BIS also helped provide liquidity to European governments during economic instability. Although the US Federal Reserve did not join the BIS until 1994, as of 2022, 63 central banks have joined. In the book, The Tower of Basel, The Shadowy History of the Secret Bank That Runs the World, British journalist Adam Lebor outlines the history of corruption and scandal at the heart of the BIS. Lebor details how the BIS had countries assign their gold reserves to BIS accounts. The BIS would also process payments between countries. This made the BIS an ATM for many nations, including Hitler's Germany during World War II. Lebor outlines how the BIS helped process payments for Hitler, which allowed the Third Reich to flourish and finance its war efforts. Lebor also examines the collaboration between Swiss bankers and Nazis in his previous book, Hitler's Secret Bankers. The BIS is also essentially immune from all banking regulation and international laws. It is seen as an independent financial entity for central bankers, run by central bankers, and virtually self-governing. Due to the BIS being located in Switzerland, it is also protected by the secretive Swiss banking laws. We don't have the space in this format to fully expound upon the tangled web of history weaved by the IMF, the World Bank, and the BIS. However, it is crucial to understand the role played by national central banks, as well as the impact of the international banking institutions. This is even more important as we shift into the age of digital currency and new powerful financial instruments. Central bank digital currencies. As banking and finance have become increasingly digitized, new ways of banking are being dreamt up. One of these tools, which will become more familiar in the coming years, is an abstract, unassuming financial instrument which has the potential to be an unseen force which coerces people to act in ways which serve the system rather than their own interests. The terms social impact finance, social impact bonds, social impact investing, pay for success, or simply impact investing describe a specific investment strategy that claims to focus on benefiting society or the environment in a positive way, in addition to reaping financial gains. A social impact bond is a contract with the public sector or governing body in which the institution pays for better social outcomes and passes on the savings to social impact investors. In this way, social impact bonds are not traditional bonds, since repayment and return on investment are dependent on achieving a desired social outcome. If the investors and institutions fail to achieve said outcomes, they receive neither a return or repayment of the principal investment. These types of investments are part of a growing trend where corporations seeking to rebrand themselves spend large amounts of money to prove their efforts. In this way, companies can claim to be expanding their social responsibility and increasing their involvement in community and social issues. One specific method for measuring the success of these programs is to base them on environmental, social, and governance criteria. This so-called ESG investing is also sometimes referred to as sustainable investing, responsible investing, or socially responsible investing. The practice has become an increasingly popular way to promote the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. However, there are major concerns about how this sort of scheme could play out. Let's imagine a social impact investor actually wanted to bet that elementary children will fail and not achieve higher grades. In that situation, an investor might be incentivized to discourage positive outcomes and instead seek a profit by encouraging negative outcomes. If this sounds preposterous, remember that in the years leading up to the 2008 financial crisis, investors were using financial tools to make profits off the losses and bankruptcy of individual homeowners.
Freddie Mac prevented households from being able to take advantage of today's mortgage rates and then bet on it.
Skeptics of social impact investing fear that these tools could remain invisible to most people while directly affecting their lives. When combined with social credit scores, social impact finance could lead to a dystopian world where billionaires and corporate executives place bets on who can pay their bills. This could also see a system where those on welfare or other assistance programs would be pressured or socially engineered towards lifestyles preferred by the social impact investors. One of the most immediate tools being announced by the international banking sector is known as central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs. The technology is still yet emerging at the time of this film, but what we do know is that dozens of governments around the world have announced their support for some form of digital currency to be issued by the central banks of each nation. These CBDCs would be held in a digital wallet by every citizen of the nation. The details and specifics will differ nation to nation, but ultimately it will involve the elimination of the use of cash and the implementation of a digital currency system where the government is capable of monitoring every transaction. It's important to note that while many of these projects will likely use blockchain technology in one capacity or another, they are not cryptocurrencies. The major difference between the two being a focus on decentralization and privacy, which were essential concepts in the early days of cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. In late 2021, Agustin Carstens, general manager of the Bank for International Settlements, began speaking in favor of the use of digital currencies, stating that central banks should take advantage of the efficiency of digital currencies. Coming from the general manager of the Central Bank of Central Banks, that's a pretty big endorsement. And shortly after Carsten's statements on efficiency, the BIS and the central banks of Australia, Malaysia, Singapore, and South Africa agreed to test the use of digital currencies for cross-border transactions. The BIS Innovation Hub say they are attempting to develop, quote, shared platforms for cross-border transactions using multiple central bank digital currencies. In a 2020 talk titled Cross-Border Payment, A Vision for the Future, Carstens gave a peek behind the curtain, detailing exactly how the bankers see CBDCs being used.
We don't know, for example, who's using a $100 bill today. We don't know who is using a 1,000 peso bill today. A key difference with the CBDC is that central bank will have absolute control on the rules and regulations that will determine the use of that expression of central bank liability. And also we will have the technology to enforce that.
Carstens views CBDCs as a tool for eliminating privacy and for central bankers to force citizens to use currency exactly when, where, and how they are told. This is the next stage in the bankers' plot to dominate and profit off of all facets of society. While what we have described here may seem fantastic or unbelievable, rest assured, the bankers have infected all aspects of our world. Even if you are not ready to see the central bank digital currencies staring you in the face, we have more than enough evidence of the criminal acts of the banking class. The banks have profited from or funded drug trafficking and countless bloody conflicts around the world. HSBC has been implicated in allowing drug cartels to pour money into their banks. Wachovia and Bank of America have also been linked to money laundering for drug cartels. Whichever angle you choose to look at this situation from, the banking cartel has clearly had an overwhelmingly negative impact on the planet. Not to mention that the people running these banks clearly have ulterior motives and plans which are guiding their decisions. What can we do to break away from the chains of the banks and the families who run them? Solutions. What can we do to break free from the clutches of the nearly all-pervasive banking system? Is it even possible to live a normal life without participating in the banking system? For starters, it is absolutely possible to live a fulfilling life without submitting to the banks. The reality is that if we continue to use the banks, we are condoning their actions by participating in their corrupted system. If we aim to live in line with our values and principles, then we ought to support institutions which align with our values and boycott those that do not. Not only is it important to boycott the banks on principle, it's also necessary because participating in the bank systems also supports other projects you might not approve of. For example, with fractional reserve banking, you deposit $1,000 into your bank and they only hold a fraction, say 10%, and the rest they invest in all kinds of projects. This could be surveillance projects, pipelines on indigenous lands, or partnering with the foundations and NGOs on nefarious schemes. The point is, you have no say in how your money is used. If you want to have a say in how your money is spent, and you need to use a financial institution, try starting with a credit union or a building society. Typically, these organizations are locally focused and customers are members who can vote how funds are used. For those who are ready to abandon the banking system altogether, research the boycott and divest from the bank movements. In the years since the Occupy movement launched, activist organizations have launched coordinated divest campaigns with hundreds of people closing their bank accounts at once. This might not be easy for everyone, and it might involve making some changes in your life to meet the logistical challenges, but it is possible. We should take note of how difficult it has become to live a life without a bank account or a credit card. If you are looking for ways to get off the fiat currencies of government, then study alternatives like private cryptocurrencies or precious metals like gold and silver. As noted earlier, there is a distinct difference between privacy coins like Monero and a CBDC. Cryptocurrencies are by no means a panacea, but for the moment, they do offer an opportunity to transact value anywhere in the world nearly instantaneously without banks or governments. Finally, as the concept of money and currency evolves, it might be time for communities to pursue the creation of new currencies altogether. This could be digital in the form of a new crypto token, or it could even be a physical currency backed by a commodity. Local freedom cells could create currencies that could be traded within an emerging alternative economy. The point is that we need new forms of exchanging value and trading goods that are not dependent on or supportive of the banksters. Breaking free of the financial prison they are attempting to erect is absolutely necessary if we wish to see the end of the pyramid of power. To learn more about the banking cartel, we suggest reading The Rothschilds, The Financial Rulers of Nations by John Reeves, The World's Banker, The History of the House of Rothschild by Niall Ferguson, The Creature from Jekyll Island, A Second Look at the Federal Reserve by G. Edward Griffin, Tower of Basel, The Shadowy History of the Secret Bank That Runs the World by Adam Lebor. We also recommend watching The Century of Enslavement by James Corbett. Chapter 12: The Crimes of the Intelligence Community. In this chapter, we are going to take a look at the history of the international intelligence community. We will be looking into the history of the British, American, Russian, Israeli, and Chinese intelligence agencies. We will focus our attention on some of the most impactful and dangerous activities committed by these 5 agencies. As with all of our investigations, we are only scratching the surface, and we highly encourage all viewers to follow the links and suggested reading in our transcript. The simple fact is that these 5 nations and the intelligence agencies which have been trained by them have been involved in a number of high-profile crimes known to much of the public, as well as lesser-known crimes which are equally disturbing. Various actions taken by the modern intelligence community include overthrowing governments, funding drug trafficking and gun running, spreading propaganda through the corporate media, spying on their own domestic populations, as well as foreign populations, targeted assassinations, and even accusations of trafficking of children, which we will explore in an upcoming episode of this series. In our chapter on the corporate media, we reported that in 1975, the U.S. Senate organized the U.S. Senate Select Committee to study governmental operations, otherwise known as the Church Committee. Church and his team were tasked with investigating abuse by the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the Internal Revenue Service. The Church Committee investigations are well known for revealing many illegal activities by the intelligence community, including the discovery of Operation Shamrock, in which the major telecommunications companies shared their traffic with the NSA from 1945 to the early 1970s. There was also a discussion about a poison dart program that could cause someone to have a heart attack. And of course, there were the infamous MKUltra documents, which revealed the CIA's efforts to manipulate and control the human mind. The Church Committee's final report, published in April 1976, also covered CIA ties with both foreign and domestic media.
We do have people who submit pieces to American journals.
The report mentions that agents had planted false stories about activists, including Martin Luther King Jr. The report found that the CIA maintained a network of several hundred foreign individuals around the world who provide intelligence for the CIA and at times attempted to influence public opinion through the use of covert propaganda. These individuals provide the CIA with direct access to many newspapers and periodicals, press services and news agencies, radio and TV stations, commercial book publishers, and other foreign media outlets. At a House Intelligence Committee hearing in 1975, CIA Director William Colby was questioned about whether the agency had employees in TV networks and newspapers. Colby declined to answer and insisted on a private executive session to discuss the details of the arrangement.
This, I think, gets into the kind of getting into the details, Mr. Chairman, that I'd like to get into in executive session.
We have also noted how big tech and Silicon Valley executives have a long history of partnering with the U.S. intelligence community via the CIA's venture capital firm, In-Q-Tel. Big tech also has a close relationship with the Western military-industrial complex. Finally, we've also exposed the relationship between the U.S. intelligence agencies and U.S. military and the Hollywood film and television industry. We are going to dive even deeper into the crimes committed by the U.S. intelligence community, but first, let's take a look at the history of intelligence itself. The history of intelligence gathering. Intelligence gathering, otherwise known as espionage or spying, involves gathering secret or confidential information or intelligence from secret sources. A person who commits espionage is considered a spy. A spy can work in the service of a government, corporation, or criminal organization. When a spy works for a corporation, it is often known as industrial espionage. For the purposes of our conversation, we will be focusing on intelligence gathering activities conducted by governments, military, and law enforcement. Intelligence gathering dates back to the 4th century BC with the publication of The Art of War by Sun Tzu, a Chinese military theorist. He emphasized the concepts of infiltration, disinformation, and counterintelligence. There are further examples of spying in the Bible, the Greek and Roman empires, and ancient Egypt. The reality is that as long as there has been war, there have been attempts to spy and gather intelligence. Espionage activity increased exponentially as empires and militaries grew bloated. In the 17th century, French King Louis XIV maintained an organized intelligence system spread across Europe so he could keep track of his enemies. The British authorities used their own espionage network to decipher codes of the enemy. During the American Civil War, Alan Pinkerton, a former detective, served as head of the Union Intelligence Service for 2 years. Agents working with Pinkerton often went undercover as Confederate soldiers and sympathizers to gather military intelligence. However, the modern intelligence community as we know it today can be traced back to the early 20th century. In 1909, the UK government created the British Secret Service, or Secret Intelligence Service, also known as MI6. MI6 is focused on covert overseas collection of intelligence in support of UK national security. The agency tasked with gathering intelligence on the domestic front was the Security Service, also known as MI5. MI5 took on an important role as the First World War began, with the agency monitoring not only foreign agents, but also pacifist and anti-draft organizations. By the end of the First World War, the UK and all the major powers had sophisticated mechanisms for the training and handling of spies, and for the sharing of intelligence gained through espionage. During the Russian Revolution, the British intelligence community helped Russians opposed to the Communist Revolution escape to Finland. Sir Paul Dukes was a legendary British spy known as the Man of 100 Faces because of his use of disguises to gain access to numerous Bolshevik organizations, including the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the Communist International, and the secret police, the Cheka.
So after Secret Service is created in the late 1800s, America didn't really have intelligence agencies per se. They had military intelligence, army intelligence, naval intelligence. So it's basically all around war intelligence. There wasn't like keep an eye on the population intelligence so much back then. It was like all kind of informalized, people ratting on each other through, personal, like they tell people straight up, I heard so-and-so talking ill against Teddy Roosevelt and you might want to keep an eye on him. The first intelligence spying in this country is GCHQ, Government Communications Headquarters from the UK. 1901, they started tapping telegraph lines and transatlantic cables. And America still didn't have any intelligence agencies like we see today until after World War I, after Versailles, right before World War II. The British set up a headquarters in New York City in the 1930s to start spying on Americans, to start assassinating Americans, to start making sure that the Americans were going to go into World War II on the side of the British. Happened in World War I. See Corbett's World War I conspiracy. It's got the whole story there. World War II would start in Rockefeller Center, where you've got British Security Coordination, which is MI6's setup in Nelson Rockefeller's Rockefeller Center, New York City. They start running spies through there, including, later in America, you've got Ian Fleming, Roald Dahl. So these guys who write children's books, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, they're living in America. They're working for like Lord Halifax and some of these other British elitists who are on the East Coast in DC, and they're circulating through American society. And sometimes they're assassinating people, right? So the book on that would be The Irregulars by Jeanette Conant. And her grandfather was James Bryant Conant, president of Harvard. So she elucidates how British spies were in this country to sway public opinion, to write propaganda pieces, to do assassinations against people who might not have been on their side of the war. America doesn't get into the war until World War II. We still don't really have any cause to have some intelligence agencies going on. But the British have a plan, and it's kind of working in the background. It's about to take seed on December 7th, 1941. Gives us just cause to do all these sort of things.
As Richard Grove notes, the MI6 had spies within the Japanese and German intelligence. The British spies gathered intelligence indicating that Japanese and German forces were considering attacking the Pearl Harbor military base. This information was obtained as early as July 1941, but the U.S. government chose to allow the Japanese to attack Pearl Harbor. Around this time, Sir William Stevenson, the senior British intelligence officer in the Western Hemisphere, suggested to U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt that a U.S. intelligence network should be created and modeled after the MI6 and Special Operations Executives framework. President Roosevelt would eventually empower William Wild Bill Donovan to run a new agency called the Office of the Coordinator of Information, which in 1942 became the Office of Strategic Services, or the OSS. OSS agents were being trained in a Canadian facility set up by Stevenson and British intelligence instructors. The MI6 and OSS special operation teams were trained to infiltrate Nazi-occupied countries to organize resistance groups behind enemy lines. After the war, the OSS eventually became the Central Intelligence Agency.
1947, Clark Clifford signs the National Security Act. A couple months later, CIA is created. And with that, you have an insertion of the State Department, the Anglophiles, the Cecil Rhodes Roundtable Group, inside as the core of the CIA. That's going to drive all its activities and overthrows and assassinations for the next 50 years. And on the outside, you've got this kind of guise of, we need a national intelligence agency, that someone to keep an eye on the Soviets, and, you know, all this other kind of what you see on TV type stuff, right? So CIA, again, you got instrumental MI6 creating CIA. So OSS and CIA are Wall Street lawyers. The people who created MI6, they were London bankers. So MI6, like the British intelligence agencies, serviced City of London bankers. And then they used American lawyers to create OSS and CIA for a large part of it, right? So the reference for that would be the Old Boys, The Origins of the OSS and CIA by Burton Hirsch. It's an excellent book. I would recommend that to anybody if you want to understand. And it's like not the top level, but Burton Hirsch does a pretty good job. He doesn't see the whole great game Rhodes picture, but he can tell you, here's who these guys were and what they did. And yeah, it takes us up to CIA. Around that time, in the 1950s, you got the creation of National Security Agency here in America, which literally mirrors GCHQ. So it's been on lockdown for a long time. They just haven't had the computing technology to really take advantage and take these great reset steps now.
As of 2022, the U.S. intelligence community has grown to one of the largest in the world. The United Kingdom's modern intelligence community is still organized under MI6 as well as MI5. Other intelligence agencies include the Government Communications Headquarters and Defense Intelligence. The History of Communist Intelligence Networks. As we start to examine the horrendous actions taken by some of the world's intelligence agencies, we need to take a look at the crimes committed with the assistance of espionage networks. Let's start by examining the intelligence apparatus formed after the Communist Revolution in Russia, under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin as well as Joseph Stalin. When the Russian Revolution turned into a civil war between communist or Bolshevik fighters and their opponents, the first version of a Soviet secret police was created. The All-Russian Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution and Sabotage, or Cheka, was established on December 5, 1917, to defend the communist revolution against so-called class enemies, which included members of the clergy and the wealthy class. Under the command of Lenin, the Cheka performed mass arrests, imprisonments, torture, and executions without trial. Lenin ordered the Cheka to begin targeting libertarians and anti-authoritarian socialists. Thousands of people would be arrested and shot without a trial. Eventually, the Cheka expanded their repression campaigns to all potential political opponents of the communist government, including anarchists and others on the left. In some cases, women would be tortured and raped before being shot. Once Lenin's Bolsheviks secured victory in the war, the party was rebranded as the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. From this point on, the intelligence community of Russia would undergo many changes. One of the most infamous agencies was the KGB, also known as the Committee for State Security. The KGB was the main security agency for the Soviet Union from March 1954 until December 1991. The agency was the direct successor of the Cheka, the GPU, OGPU, and other previous Russian intelligence branches. In addition to the Russian intelligence community assisting in the creation of a communist police state, they also carried out many secret operations. The NKVD infiltrated and destroyed groups in support of Leon Trotsky, a revolutionary and ally of Lenin's who was ultimately expelled from the nation after the rise of Joseph Stalin. In 1940, Trotsky would be assassinated in Mexico City under the orders of Stalin and the Russian intelligence network. Another project carried out by Russian intelligence was known as Operation Trust, or the Trust Operation. Organized by the Cheka and then the GPU from 1921 to 1926, Trust was a counterintelligence operation involving a fake anti-Bolshevik resistance organization called Monarchist Union of Central Russia. The fake resistance group was used to identify and catch anti-Bolshevik activists and so-called counter-revolutionaries. According to historian John Costello, the Trust files are 37 volumes of bewildering tales of double agents, changed code names, and interlocking deception operations which are difficult to decipher. Some conspiracy researchers believe the recent phenomenon known as QAnon was actually a modern version of an Operation Trust or similar program designed to lead a false resistance while spreading misinformation. Russia's current security agency is the Federal Security Service of the Russian Federation, or the FSB. The agency focuses on domestic espionage, including counterintelligence, internal and border security, counterterrorism, and surveillance. The FSB has been linked with the manufacturing of advanced malware tools and tools capable of hiding their activities. Reportedly, the FSB oversees training and research institutes which directly support the FSB's cyber mission. The Foreign Intelligence Service, or SVR, is Russia's primary civilian foreign intelligence service. It is responsible for the collection of foreign intelligence using human, signals, electronic, and cyber methods. The agency is known for high levels of technical expertise and a focus on gaining and retaining access to compromised networks. The main directorate of the General Staff, commonly referred to as the GRU, is Russia's military intelligence agency. Both the GRU and the SVR have been accused of actions such as election interference in the 2016 U.S. presidential election, as well as multiple cyber attacks.
No country has weaponized its cyber capabilities as maliciously and irresponsibly as Russia.
The U.S. government has accused the SVR of being one of two Russian cyber units which allegedly hacked the political campaigns during the 2016 U.S. presidential election. They have also accused Unit 26165 of hacking the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, the Democratic National Committee, and the presidential campaign of Hillary Clinton. As of 2022, the accusations of Russian hacking have not been substantiated and in some cases have been proven wrong. Either way, whether Russia hacked the U.S. presidential election, and to whatever degree that may have had some small impact, we should not dismiss the real dangers posed by the Russian intelligence community. The History of Israeli Intelligence. Before we explore the history of the Israeli intelligence community, it is worth noting that the State of Israel as it exists today would not have happened without support of the Rothschild family. While not all members of the Rothschild family supported the project, several family members figure prominently into Israeli history. As early as 1917, Walter Rothschild, 2nd Baron Rothschild, committed the British government to support Palestine as a national home for the Jewish people. Baron Edmund James de Rothschild, a French member of the Rothschild banking family, helped finance the first permanent settlement in Palestine at Rishon LeZion. He would take an active role in the Jewish Colonization Association and transfer his Palestinian land and 15 million francs to the organization. In 1924, Rothschild reorganized the Jewish Colonization Association into the Palestine Jewish Colonization Association and purchased more than 125,000 acres of land for business ventures in the new Jewish state. For more on the history of the Rothschilds' involvement in the founding of Israel, I recommend reading Rothschild and Early Colonization of Palestine. The intelligence networks in modern-day Israel are the successors of the organizations established before and during the birth of the State of Israel. Around 1920, the Zionist movement in British Mandate Palestine organized Haganah, the main Zionist paramilitary organizations comprised of various militias which united behind the cause of a Jewish homeland. Haganah would ultimately be dissolved in 1948 and become the official army of the State of Israel. Around 1940, Shai was established as the intelligence gathering and counter-espionage wing of Haganah. During World War II, the secretive British Special Operations Executive trained and funded the Haganah, as well as supplying them with weapons. The British also provided special commando training for the Shai. Shai, in turn, began infiltrating British Mandate offices to inform the Jewish and Zionist leadership of any potential actions by the British and collected political information that could be used as propaganda. The Mossad, or the Institute for Intelligence and Special Operations, or simply the Institute, was formed on December 13, 1949, as part of the new intelligence apparatus for the State of Israel. This apparatus also included Amman, focused on military intelligence, and Shabak, focused on internal security, and the intelligence branch of the Israeli police. Amman, or the Military Intelligence Directorate, is the top-level military intelligence branch of the Israeli Defense Forces Intelligence Corps. Meanwhile, Shabak, or Shin Bet, is the agency focused on maintaining internal peace, including in the Israeli-occupied territories. The crimes of the Israeli intelligence community have filled books. The Israelis are infamous for pursuing political targets beyond their own borders and committing assassinations. These assassinations include foreign intelligence leaders such as Colonel Mustafa Hafez, head of Egyptian intelligence in the Gaza Strip. Hafez was involved in ordering violence against Israeli citizens and ultimately found himself the victim of an explosive envelope which blew off both of his hands before he died a week later. Israeli intelligence has also used their extensive surveillance networks to embarrass their enemies. In February 1956, the Mossad obtained a copy of Russian leader Nikita Khrushchev's speech denouncing the actions of his predecessor Joseph Stalin. A copy of his speech was sent to the United States via the Mossad and was subsequently published to expose the fracture within the Soviet regime. Another important connection to Israeli intelligence is that of convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. I began investigating the Epstein network back in 2016 and eventually produced a documentary titled Bringing Down Jeffrey Epstein. One of the most frightening aspects of the Epstein tale is that the abuse of young girls by Epstein and his alleged co-conspirators may have been sanctioned by the British, American, and/or Israeli intelligence community. Alexander Acosta, Donald Trump's one-time labor secretary, was involved in the 2008 decision to let Epstein off with a, quote, sweetheart deal after his first arrest for suspicion of trafficking young girls. Acosta was the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Florida who agreed to a plea deal which had been negotiated by Alan Dershowitz, himself a suspected participant in Epstein's activities. Almost a decade later, it was reported that while Acosta was being confirmed to Trump's cabinet as labor secretary, he stated that he was told Epstein was above his pay grade. Quote, I was told Epstein belonged to intelligence and to leave it alone. When Acosta was questioned about this, he stated,
Secretary, were you ever made aware at any point in your handling of this case that Mr. Epstein was an intelligence asset of some sort?
So there has been reporting to that effect. And let me say, there's been reporting to a lot of effects in this case, not just now, but over the years. And again, I would I would hesitate to take this reporting as fact. This was a case that was brought by our office. It was brought based on the facts. And I look at that reporting and others. I can't address it directly because of our guidelines. But I can tell you that a lot of reporting is just going down rabbit holes. A few more questions.
Additional potential intelligence connections to Epstein, which point at Israel, include his relationship to Ghislaine Maxwell, now convicted for her role in Epstein's network. Ghislaine Maxwell's involvement with Epstein is important because her father, Robert Maxwell, has also been suspected of being an undercover agent working for the Israeli Mossad. In 1991, veteran investigative journalist Seymour Hersh released the book The Samson Option, which reported on Maxwell's close connections to Israeli intelligence. In 2002, another book titled Robert Maxwell, Israel's Super Spy, was released by researchers Gordon Thomas and Martin Dillon. The book claimed that Maxwell worked as a double agent for the Israeli Mossad and Britain's MI6, and also had connections to organized crime in Eastern Europe. The authors also wrote that Maxwell had been murdered by the Israeli Mossad because he was apparently threatening to expose Israeli secrets.
Accused sex trafficker Jeffrey Epstein is dead. Officials say the disgraced financier died by suicide.
Jeffrey Epstein's own alleged suicide is largely suspected to be either a rescue operation or an assassination by an intelligence community which no longer saw him as useful. Finally, Jeffrey Epstein's relationship with Leslie Wexner, the owner of the Limited brands, including Victoria's Secret, is another source of potential intelligence relationships. In the 1980s, Epstein had joined investment firm Bear Stearns after a stint as a school teacher and was quickly making connections in the New York finance world. Around this time, Les Wexner and Jeffrey Epstein became acquainted. By 1995, Wexner sold Epstein his 45,000 square foot, 8-story mansion on East 71st Street in New York City for $1. Wexner was considered to be one of the most prominent Jewish philanthropists. One of these efforts includes organizing what was sometimes known as the Study Group, but more commonly known as the Mega Group. The Wall Street Journal reported in 1998 that the Mega Group was a group of elite Jewish philanthropists that was formed in 1991 and developed as an effort to conduct a high-minded, philanthropic discussion about the pressing issues of the Jewish people. The Mega Group is suspected of being a front for Israeli intelligence. Whether or not we will ever have solid evidence that Epstein was indeed an agent of the Mossad or other intelligence agency, we know for a fact that Epstein and the Israeli spy units have long been interested in computer technology. The Israelis have been focused on training the younger generations to be masters of digital tools. The Israeli intelligence community has spent years making itself the nexus of digital technology and cybersecurity. For example, the city of Beersheba is home to the brain of the country. Beersheba is home to a technological complex which has given birth to some of the leading IT security companies in the world. The Israeli intelligence network has also focused on forming public-private partnerships with private companies involved in cybersecurity and similar fields. As journalist Whitney Webb reported in 2020, one such company is CyberReason, a firm focused on selling technological cybersecurity solutions like antivirus and ransomware protection software. The company offers a technological defense platform to companies and governments using artificial intelligence and cloud computing via Amazon Web Services. CyberReason is one of the many companies whose board of directors and employee list is riddled with officials with formal training from Israeli intelligence. CyberReason's CEO Lior Div has openly admitted that he views his work at CyberReason as a continuation of his service to Israel's intelligence apparatus. One of the agencies which has a large contingent in private industries is the signal intelligence agency known as Unit 8200, best known for its cyber offenses against other governments. Unit 8200 is an elite unit mainly involved in signal intelligence, surveillance, cyber warfare, and code decryption. Sometimes compared to the Israeli equivalent of the United States NSA, Unit 8200 is infamous for surveillance of Palestinian civilians and using intercepted communications as blackmail against Palestinians living in the occupied West Bank. In fact, the NSA and Unit 8200 have collaborated on numerous projects, including the Stuxnet virus. The NSA has also worked with veterans of Unit 8200 in the private sector. In one incident, the NSA hired 2 Israeli companies to create backdoors into all the major US telecommunications systems and major tech companies, including Facebook, Microsoft, and Google. The executives of the two companies, Verint and Neris, have ties to Israeli intelligence. While Unit 8200 is an important piece of the Israeli intelligence puzzle, two lesser-known programs also deserve attention. First, the Talpiot program is another so-called elite program under the Israeli Defense Forces, which has been hosted by Hebrew University since 1979. Talpiot has a couple meanings in Hebrew, but it is generally translated to mean stronghold or tall turrets. The program was initiated by Professor Felix Dothan and Professor Shaul Yatziv of the Hebrew University with the idea of harnessing human creativity at a young age and training recruits with outstanding academic ability in the sciences and leadership potential. In a rare instance of mainstream media reporting on Talpiot, a 2007 Wall Street Journal article described Talpiot as, quote, the country's most selective institution. It accepts 50 students a year and trains them in physics, computers, and other sciences. Its mission is to create innovative, tech-savvy leaders capable of transforming Israel's military. Soldiers picked for Talpiot aren't expected to fight like ordinary soldiers. Instead, they are selected for a, quote, ultra-competitive, grueling, fast-paced program designed to give them the best educational and military training possible. Talpiot recruits are chosen for a decade and taught by, quote, some of the world's top minds in mathematics, physics, and computer science, as well as some of Israel's top strategic leaders from the Army, Navy, and Air Force. Just like with Unit 8200, graduates of Talpiot have developed a habit of forming tech companies. Once a graduate leaves Unit 8200 or Talpiot, they take what they learned for the IDF and apply it to the Israeli economy. Talpiot graduates hire each other and help each other find jobs once in the private sector, which has resulted in a rapidly growing tech industry in Israel. As a result of the startup culture produced by these elite intelligence units, Israel has more companies listed on the NASDAQ stock exchange than any country except the United States. A perfect example of this pattern can be seen in the life of Zohar Zisapel, who has been referred to as the father of Israel's tech sector. Mr. Zisapel is credited with starting 27 companies in the last 30 years. He is co-founder and chairman of the RAD Data Communications. RAD is a solutions provider for more than 100 telecom operators around the world, including AT&T, British Telecom, Deutsche Telekom, France Telecom, Japan Telecom, and Orange France. It provides communication tools to major players in the banking, commerce, education, finance, government, military, transportation, and utility sectors. Clearly, RAD Group is an important player in the tech sector. Although it's not 100% clear if Zohar Zisapel served time in Talpiot, he is a veteran of another special unit known as Unit 81. Just as with Talpiot, Zisapel and veterans of Unit 81 support each other by investing in each other's companies. Unit 81 was originally known by the generic name the Intelligence Corps' Technological Unit until the military approved for it to be called by its official name. The unit is made up of mostly Talpiot graduates. Recruits serve in the unit for the minimum of 3 years mandatory service before departing to civilian life and launching lots of companies. According to one estimate, soldiers and officers who served in Unit 81 between 2003 and 2010 have gone on to found a massive number of startups. Roughly 100 veterans of the unit have founded 50 companies so far. One Talpiot graduate describes the benefits of Unit 81. The unit practically invented cyber education and recruited people who were very skilled at programming and computer science. Some of them got a taste for cyber in high school as amateur hackers. There were 18-year-old geniuses taking part in these courses who were entirely self-taught and possessed more knowledge than the instructors. Clearly, the Israeli intelligence community has played a major role in the growth of the nation's tech sector. But more importantly, the Israeli intelligence network poses a great danger to the privacy and security of the systems in which they have maneuvered themselves into. For example, independent media outlet Narrative reported that Israeli company Carbine 9/11 had received substantial funding from Jeffrey Epstein, as well as Epstein's close associate, former head of Israeli military intelligence and former Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Barak. Carbine 9/11 also received funding from Silicon Valley venture capitalist Peter Thiel. Carbine 911 is a plugin for emergency call centers and an app for consumers which promises to make call handling easier and to help identify a caller. It has begun to be used in emergency response services in countries around the world, including the United States, where it has already been implemented in several U.S. counties and has partnered with major U.S. tech companies like Google. Carbine works by giving a 911 dispatcher access to the caller's camera and GPS to provide the worker with a live feed. Carbine's executive team is filled with former members of Israeli intelligence, including Unit 8200. Carbine's current CEO, Amir Elikai, served in Unit 8200. He hired former Unit 8200 commander Pinchas Bukris to serve as the company's director. Carbine co-founder Lital Leshem also served in Unit 8200 and later worked for Israeli private spy company Black Cube. Michael Chertoff, who ran Homeland Security under U.S. President George Bush, also serves on Carbine's advisory board. Chertoff wrote the Patriot Act, which authorized digital surveillance of Americans. The combination of a tool like Carbine 911 and the presence of the Israeli sector of the military intelligence surveillance complex is plenty reason to be concerned about the potential for mass surveillance and the infiltration of important emergency systems around the world. For example, Carbine's smartphone app gathers a device's location, video live streamed from the smartphone to the call center, and other data from the phone. According to Carbine's website, this same information can also be obtained from any smartphone, even if it does not have Carbine's app installed, if that phone calls a 911 call center that uses Carbine. Again, this means there is incredible potential for a firm like Carbine, with its numerous connections to Israeli intelligence, to gain access to private data from people all around the world. And this is only one company. The Israeli intelligence community is loved by some, feared by many, and operating in the shadows to most. Between Unit 8200, Talpiot, Unit 81, and the hundreds of companies they have created, there is a very real potential for the Israeli spies to have unimaginable access and control of digital infrastructure around the world. The Chinese Intelligence Network. The Chinese Communist Party and the People's Liberation Army are the leading bodies in the People's Republic of China. These organizations have overseen the transformation of China's intelligence apparatus since the revolution and civil war nearly 100 years ago. Due to the CCP's extreme level of secrecy, the exact details of China's espionage operations are not known. What follows is a partial summary. The People's Liberation Army intelligence focuses on collecting foreign military, economic, and political intelligence. The PLA answers to China's Central Military Commission, China's leading military authority. Other military and intelligence forces include the People's Liberation Army Reserve Force, the People's Armed Police, and the militia. Additionally, the Ministry of State Security coordinates foreign intelligence operations. Just like Israel, China is increasingly focused on cyber espionage. Chinese intelligence services have proven they are capable of infiltrating U.S. national security operations. For example, in October 2018, the U.S. government announced the arrest of a Chinese Ministry of State Security operative named Yan Junzhu. He was charged with conspiring and attempting to commit economic espionage and steal trade secrets from multiple U.S. aviation and aerospace companies. Zhu was extradited to the United States. In recent decades, the Chinese Communist Party has committed to cyber warfare and information warfare. Cyber warfare sees the internet and other digital infrastructure as another battleground in an asymmetric war. Two People's Liberation Army colonels outline this theory in the book Unrestricted Warfare, writing, quote, "Methods that are not characterized by the use of the force of arms, nor by the use of military power, nor by even the presence of casualties and bloodshed, are just as likely to facilitate the successful realization of the war's goals, if not more so." Information warfare for the Chinese Communist Party is focused on 5 major elements: the use of hard weapons to destroy enemy headquarters, command posts, and command and control information centers; electronic warfare, using electronic means of jamming or the use of anti-radiation electromagnetic weapons to attack enemy information and intelligence collection systems; military deception; operational security; psychological warfare using TV, radio, the internet to undermine the enemy's military morale. Information warfare is itself a subset of what China calls informationization. Informationization has been described as embracing all the opportunities and technologies the information age can offer and integrating them into military systems. While we do not have a completely clear picture of the operations of the Chinese intelligence community, we can surmise that their operations include spying on their own people via social credit scores and facial recognition cameras, infiltrating foreign governments and militaries, as well as the private sector, and disseminating propaganda to their own people and the international community. The modern crimes of the intelligence community. Our final study will briefly look at some of the more recent actions of the U.S. intelligence community. While the CIA infiltrating the mass media is a massive violation, it hardly scratches the surface of what we have seen the intelligence community commit. It is true that the state-sanctioned propaganda poses a real threat to liberty, but it does not match the horrors unleashed by the U.S. government over the last 60 years. Beginning in late 1956, the CIA participated in Operation Gladio, a secret arrangement between the Western Union, NATO, the CIA, and European intelligence agencies. Gladio involved creating stay-behind operations where Western intelligence agents were placed in undercover positions to counter communist influence. The U.S. government has been accused of funding militant left-wing terrorist groups and staging false flag attacks. The CIA and U.S. government officials have denied the claims, stating that the accusations are rehashed former Soviet disinformation based on documents that the Soviets forged. However, an Italian investigation into Operation Gladio led to Judge Guido Salvini concluding that some terrorist organizations were part of a secret army which had links to the CIA. Salvini also said the CIA encouraged the groups to commit atrocities. In 2000, an Italian parliamentary report stated that the bombings had been organized, supported, or promoted by Italian officials with links to American intelligence. The CIA is also known for its role in overthrowing democratically elected governments and funding puppet activist movements. Operation Condor is one example of the depravities which were officially sanctioned by the U.S. intelligence community. Condor was a U.S. government-backed campaign of state terror and repression of political opponents by right-wing dictatorships in South America. The operation officially began in November 1975 with the U.S. government providing planning, training on torture methods, technical support, and military aid during the Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, and Reagan administrations. The CIA often funneled the funds to the dictatorships with support and backing of former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. Operation Condor resulted in the torture and death of tens of thousands of people throughout South America, as well as the loss of civil liberties and the general terror of living through such dark times. The CIA was not content to only support torture and murder via foreign dictatorships. They also embraced assassinations and torture as part of the infamous Phoenix program. The program was designed, coordinated, and executed by the CIA and the United States Special Operations Forces during the Vietnam War. The Phoenix program was designed to identify and neutralize the infrastructure of the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, or the Viet Cong. Neutralizing a target could involve infiltration, capture, terrorism, torture, and assassination. The CIA described it as a, quote, set of programs that sought to attack and destroy the political infrastructure of the Viet Cong. People suspected of being Viet Cong members were taken to interrogation centers where many of them were tortured in an attempt to gain intelligence on Viet Cong activities in the area. The information extracted at the centers was then given to military commanders who would use it for further capture and assassination missions. The program was in operation between 1965 and 1972, and similar efforts existed both before and after that period. By 1972, Phoenix operatives had neutralized 81,740 suspected Viet Cong operatives, informants, and supporters, with somewhere between 26,000 and 41,000 people having been murdered. One of the only reasons the Phoenix program is known to the world is because of the research of Douglas Valentine, who actually sat down directly with CIA operatives, including former CIA Director William Colby.
I went to William Colby in 1984. He was the CIA official most associated with the Phoenix program. As I said earlier, he testified about Phoenix very favorably to Congress in 1971, 1972, and 1973 again. I went to Colby, and I told him I wanted to write a book about the Phoenix program, and for reasons I'm not quite sure of, it may have to do with the fact that I wrote a book about World War II, which he read and which he liked. Colby introduced me to all the senior CIA officers who were involved in the Phoenix program. My book was almost totally based on tape-recorded conversations with the senior CIA officers who ran its covert action programs.
After interviewing Colby and senior CIA officers about the program, Valentine published his 1991 book, The Phoenix Program, America's Use of Terror in Vietnam.
Just like today, if it's a CIA program, the media doesn't talk about it. But in fact, the CIA set up a Phoenix center in every province, district, and city in South Vietnam. And these centers were composed of representatives from all the intelligence, security, police, and military organizations that existed in Vietnam at the time. And they would compile blacklists on people who were suspected of being in the National Liberation Front, and they would hand these blacklists to the death squads that they had put together, that the CIA actually funded and recruited people to be part of. And these death squads would go out and capture people and put them into, send them to, if they didn't kill them, they'd send them to secret CIA interrogation centers.
According to Valentine, methods of torture that were utilized at the interrogation centers include rape, gang rape, rape using needles, snakes, or hard objects, and rape followed by murder. Electrical shock rendered by attaching wires to the genitals and other sensitive body parts like the tongue, the water treatment, the airplane in which a prisoner's arms were tied behind the back and the rope looped over a hook on the ceiling, suspending the prisoner in midair, after which he or she would be beaten. Beatings with rubber hoses and whips, and the use of police dogs to maul prisoners. The U.S. intelligence community's support of torture didn't end with the Vietnam War. After the attacks of September 11, 2001, the U.S. government began spying on Americans' phone calls as part of the new push for a national security state to fight off the specter of terrorism. In the days following the 9/11 attacks, the U.S. government sanctioned mass kidnapping of American citizens and foreigners suspected of potential connection to terrorism. The CIA also began operating a network of so-called black sites, secret prisons for torturing suspected extremists or terrorists. The CIA would kidnap individuals abroad and take them to an unknown location where they would be denied access to a lawyer and basic human rights while also being subjected to disturbing torture methods. While many of these details surrounding black sites are still classified, in 2014, Poland admitted to being a host nation for such black sites. It's important that we recognize how much secrecy exists around the intelligence communities we have just exposed. The information we shared is based on previous reporting, agency statements, and declassified documents. However, the reality is that we might not ever know the truth of how far these agencies have gone in the name of preserving so-called national security. For example, some of these agencies, the British MI6, the US CIA and FBI, the Israeli Mossad, have also been accused of staging terror attacks, what are sometimes referred to as false flag attacks. We will explore this subject in depth in an upcoming episode, but we may never find a document that clearly identifies the crimes and players involved in the countless operations, surveillance, torture, rape, and murder. The truth is likely lost to the pages of history or hidden forever in an encrypted, classified government database. Solutions. Are there solutions for a situation in which numerous agencies, which are invisible to the average person, are capable of peering into every detail of our lives while also being capable of excruciating violence? Is it possible to understand all that we have uncovered and still have hope for the future of the world? Obviously, the answer is subjective and will largely be dependent on your current state of mind. Personally, I do find reason to be hopeful. I'm not talking about a false sense of hopium that someone is coming to save the day, but a real recognition that there are many, many people working on solutions for overcoming the current power structures, including the intelligence community. In the end, maybe we are outmatched, outgunned, and outhacked, but I choose to continue to focus on the solutions I can implement in my own life and focus on building a better tomorrow. I choose to question authority and continue exposing the lies of the intelligence community. Sometimes, the only solution is to spread awareness to those around us so we can finally break through the veil of ignorance. To learn more about the history and crimes of the intelligence community, we encourage you to watch the following: Secrets of the CIA, Mind Control, America's Secret War, Counterintelligence Shining a Light on Black Operations, Psy War, and How the CIA Deceived the Country During the Vietnam War.